The air was colder than I expected, even for late autumn. As I walked toward the gates of the abandoned prison, I could feel the chill settling into my bones, slow and persistent. The sky was bruised with the colors of dusk, muted purples and deep grays folding into one another, the last fading light slipping away behind the jagged outline of the building. I hesitated at the edge of the cracked asphalt, letting my eyes sweep over the massive structure. It was silent, not the silence of a forest or a desert, which carries a weight of natural calm, but the silence of a place that had been emptied, sucked dry of its purpose. The heavy stone walls, darkened with years of rain and smoke, rose like ancient teeth from the ground. Rusted fences leaned at angles, and the barbed wire, once sharp and purposeful, sagged in lazy loops that caught the dim light and glimmered like dull steel tears. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on gravel and loose concrete. Every step echoed, a small, tentative intrusion into the stillness. The gate, a rusted lattice of iron, creaked when I pushed it. It moved reluctantly, groaning in a way that sounded almost human, as though it resented being disturbed. Inside, the prison yard was empty, littered with weeds that had grown long and stubborn between cracked tiles and broken fragments of bricks and glass. I could see shadows beginning to stretch across the walls, long fingers reaching toward me from the corners of the yard. I tried to steady my breathing. It was easy to imagine the lives that had moved through this place. The footsteps of prisoners pacing back and forth, the guards' keys jangling in the hallways, the heavy thud of cell doors slamming shut. My mind filled in details I couldn't see. Faces, pale and anxious, peering from behind bars. A sigh that seemed like it could still echo in the empty corridors. I shivered. Even though my coat was thick, the main building was immense. Its windows, dark and empty, stared back at me like hollow eyes. Some panes were broken, some completely missing, leaving jagged edges that seemed to warn me away. The walls were pocked with cracks and streaked with decades of rain, and in some places moss and black mold clung stubbornly to the stone, growing as if the building itself were slowly reclaiming itself from the world of the living. I found the entrance, a heavy steel door that had been left partially open. I paused, hand hovering over the cold metal. The air smelled faintly of damp stone rust and something older, something almost imperceptibly metallic. I pushed the door wider, and it moaned as if warning me to turn back. Inside, darkness swallowed me, though the dimming light from outside still seeped into the cracks and broken windows. The first corridor stretched ahead, long and narrow, lined with cell doors on either side. I could see inside a few of the closest cells. The floors were layered with dust, scattered debris, and the occasional rusted object that hinted at what had once been here. A bucket, a chair, a mattress frame. The walls were scribbled with faded messages, names scratched deep into the stone, marks of frustration and desperation left by people who had lived, or perhaps only survived, in these cells. The air inside felt heavier, thicker. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and loud in my ears. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to take it all in without panicking. There was no sudden movement, no loud noises, just the sound of my own cautious footsteps and the faint sighing of wind as it slipped through cracks in the walls. Occasionally, a loose shutter or a piece of metal clattered softly somewhere deep inside, and I would freeze, straining to see, before convincing myself it was only the building settling. I moved slowly, exploring the first cell block. Light from the windows cast long, angled shadows across the walls, creating shapes that shifted as I passed. Every shadow seemed alive for a moment, as though a person or a creature were crouched just out of sight, watching. My mind insisted on filling in those empty spaces, imagining what had been there years ago. I tried to remind myself that this was simply an abandoned building, left to rot, but the feeling of eyes on me persisted, unrelenting. The further I walked, the stronger the sense of time suspended became. It was as if the prison existed in its own bubble, where the hours, days, and years had stopped. A lone chair remained upright in the middle of the corridor, its legs wobbly and rusted, yet it seemed almost waiting for someone to return and sit. The air smelled faintly of old paper and mildew, and somewhere, far away in another corridor, a door creaked softly. I froze, listening. The sound and repeat didn't echo. It simply stopped, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it entirely. I ventured deeper into the building, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam revealed peeling paint, sections of wall crumbled into powdery dust, and floorboards that creaked under even the lightest weight. I noticed the details. Old stains that had long since dried into the stone, the slight warp in some of the doors, the way certain hallways bent at angles that didn't make sense in the floor plan. All of it combined into a feeling that the building itself was subtly off. At one point, I stopped to lean against a wall. My palm pressed against the stone, and I could feel the cool, damp texture beneath my fingers. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to center myself. The wind outside whispered through the broken windows, and for a fleeting instant, it almost sounded like voices carried on its breath, names murmured too softly to understand. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought, but the notion lingered, a shadow of a possibility that the past hadn't entirely left. The courtyard outside called to me intermittently through the broken windows. I could see the last streaks of light from the sky disappearing, leaving a dusky gray that made it hard to distinguish shapes. I thought about the prisoners, pacing the yard under watchful eyes, the guards' footsteps marking time. That sense of repetition, of life constrained and observed, was still palpable in the space, lingering even decades later. Eventually, I reached the end of the first corridor. The walls here were darker, almost blackened in places, and the air was heavier. I could feel it pressing down, a subtle pressure that made my shoulders ache. The building seemed to exhale slowly, as though aware of my presence. I took another cautious step forward, and the sound of my own boots seemed deafening in comparison to the oppressive silence that surrounded me. I stopped to look back down the corridor. The shadows seemed longer now, stretching impossibly far. For a moment, I imagined figures standing at the far end, watching me. But when I blinked, there was nothing, just the empty hallway, lined with darkened cells and a faint smell of rust and mildew. I knew, logically, that the building was empty, but the sensation of being observed lingered, an echo of something I couldn't name. As dusk deepened into night, the prison transformed. Shapes blended into one another. The shadows moved ever so slightly with the breeze, and the faint sound of metal shifting made me startle more than once. I reminded myself that I was safe, that this was only a building, that no one had lived here for decades. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that the walls themselves remembered, that they held within their stone and steel the countless hours of despair, frustration, and small, desperate rebellions of those who had once been trapped inside. I stood for a moment in the center of the corridor, flashlight in hand, listening. A deep, slow sigh of wind slipped through the broken windows. The shadows seemed to pulse slightly, alive with memory. I swallowed and pressed forward. This was only the beginning of the night, I told myself. Only the start of an exploration that would take me deeper into the heart of a place that had long since been abandoned, but that had never truly let go of what had passed within its walls. And so, with each step, I moved further into the building, fully aware that the prison was no longer just a place of stone and steel, but keeper of secrets, a witness to sorrow, a vessel of memory that might follow me long after I left. The evening had fully settled now. The light was gone. Only the dark remained heavy and silent, pressing down with a weight that made the air itself feel alive. And in that silence I felt it, the first small brush of something waiting, something unseen, something that had been here long before me, and would remain long after I left. The further I moved into the prison, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was thick with memory, with the residue of countless days and nights lived behind these walls. Every step I took along the cracked linoleum floors echoed differently in each corridor, bouncing off stone and steel in ways that made the silence feel uneven, unsettled. It was as if the building itself was breathing slowly, shifting imperceptibly around me. I stopped near one of the open cells, letting my flashlight sweep across the interior. Dust floated in the dim beam, motes dancing like tiny, restless spirits. I could see the iron bed frame, bent and rusted, with the remnants of a threadbare mattress crumbling into dust. Against the wall, a small desk leaned awkwardly, the surface scarred with deep scratches. Names, initials, dates, some etched neatly, some hastily carved in trembling lines. I crouched to examine one of them. J. Harris, 1957, I whispered, my voice swallowing itself in the vast corridor. The letters seemed to carry weight. the memory of the person who had spent long hours here, writing their existence into stone. I tried to imagine him sitting on that mattress, hunched over the desk, the dim light of a barred window casting shadows across his face. I imagined his thoughts, his fears, the monotony pressing down day after day, year after year. A faint sound brushed against my ears, a shuffling step somewhere far down the hall. I froze. My pulse jumped, though I told myself it was a building settling, or perhaps a loose piece of metal shifting somewhere unseen. Still, I waited, straining to listen. A second step followed, soft, deliberate, and then silence. I told myself it was nothing, but the hairs on my neck stood on end anyway. I continued forward, moving slowly, deliberately, letting my flashlight illuminate one cell at a time. Each one felt like a frozen moment, a snapshot of life in suspended animation. Some cells were nearly empty, save for a few broken items. Others held evidence of the past in more tangible ways. A small cracked cup, a tattered book, a single shoe left behind as if its owner had simply vanished. The objects were mundane, but they carried a weight that pressed against my chest, a subtle, gnawing sense of what had been endured here. I paused in a larger cell block, where the shadows pooled like ink in the corners. Here, the walls were scrawled with messages, some desperate, some angry, others nearly illegible with age. I ran my fingers along the grooves, careful not to disturb the fragile dust. A few lines were legible. I can't breathe here. They will never let me out. I will be forgotten. Each phrase seemed to hang in the air, almost audible if I concentrated hard enough. I swallowed, feeling the building's weight press closer, and moved on. As I walked, the corridor seemed to stretch, bending slightly in ways my mind couldn't account for. Light from the windows fell unevenly across the floor, creating long, shifting rectangles that moved as the evening waned. In the distance, I thought I heard voices, soft, indistinct murmurs that could have been anyone or no one at all. They weren't threatening. They weren't loud. But they were there, just beyond my understanding, like whispers carried by the walls themselves. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The sound was faint, like water dripping slowly in a far corner, but with rhythm, a cadence that suggested steps or movement. My imagination filled in shapes. A man pacing his cell, a woman sitting on a cot, leaning over her hands, the shadows of guards moving the corridors outside. I forced myself to breathe, to remember that it was only the building settling, that no one had lived here for decades. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of presence, subtle and unrelenting. I moved into the next section, where the cells were smaller, narrower. The air here smelled more sharply of mold and rust, and the faint traces of smoke lingered from some long-forgotten fire. Here, the whispers seemed clearer, though I could still not place their origin. One of them sounded like a man counting aloud. 1, 2, 3. The next was softer, almost a sigh, like someone exhaling their exhaustion, their hopelessness. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. I shook it, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but my skin prickled, sensitive to the tiniest sounds. I crouched in front of a cell with graffiti that covered every available surface. The walls were layered with writing, numbers, letters, dates, and strange symbols that defied immediate understanding. I traced them with my fingers. Some looked like prison codes or tally marks, tracking days or months. Others were more abstract, almost frantic, the lines intersecting and curling in chaotic spirals. Whoever had written this had been desperate to leave a mark, to communicate something that might never be understood. I felt an odd connection to them, a sadness that lingered in the air. The faint steps continued, now accompanied by what sounded like a soft scraping, as if metal were rubbing against stone. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but saw nothing. The cells were empty, and yet the sound persisted, echoing just out of reach. I forced myself to move forward, footstep by cautious footstep, and told myself it was the wind shifting loose debris, though I knew it didn't quite fit. The sound was too deliberate, too measured, too human. I reached a wider corridor, where the ceiling had collapsed in places. Moonlight filtered through the gaps, casting irregular shapes on the floor. I noticed remnants of clothing scattered about, faded and brittle. A small shoe, torn and dirty, caught my attention. It lay at an odd angle, as though the owner had left it behind in haste, or as though someone else had placed it there, long after the fact. I knelt, studying it, feeling an unexpected pang of sorrow for a life interrupted, a story that would never be told. In that moment, the whispers returned. They were closer now. Faint murmurs that seemed almost like conversation, overlapping voices that made no sense together. One voice, soft and deliberate, whispered my name. I froze, breath caught in my throat, heart hammering. I told myself it was impossible, that the building had no one inside, but the instinct to look over my shoulder was overwhelming. I did, slowly, and saw nothing. Just empty cells, shadows stretching toward the corners, and the pale light of dusk fading into night. I pressed forward, letting my flashlight sweep across each cell. The whispers ebbed and flowed, almost like they were leading me somewhere, or warning me to stop. I tried to focus on the objects in the cells. The rusted bed frames, the crumbling desks, the scratched walls. Each one seemed alive with memory, holding on to the fragments of lives once confined here. I could imagine the routines of the prisoners, the quiet despair, the whispered conversations at night, the occasional outbursts of anger or grief, all playing in loops, repeating in the empty space like ghosts of memory. At the far end of the corridor, I noticed a small room that had been left locked. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the whispers pressing against me from all sides. The faint smell of smoke and iron seemed stronger here, almost tangible. I could hear a rhythm, soft and measured, like a pulse, echoing through the walls. I imagined the person who had lasted inside, closing the door, leaving something behind that had never been found, a trace of life trapped in the stone and steel. I stepped closer to the door, hand trembling slightly as I brushed the edge of the frame. My flashlight flickered briefly, then steadied. The room was empty, as far as I could see, but the whispers were louder here, wrapping around me, pressing into my mind. I had the overwhelming sensation that the voices were not random, not echoes of the past, but something deliberate. Someone or something was aware of me. The thought made my chest tighten, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to remain calm, to remember that it was just a building, abandoned and empty. I backed away from the door, letting the whispers fade into the background, though their rhythm lingered in my ears. I continued down the corridor, each step measured, deliberate. The further I walked, the more the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, as if reshaping themselves around me. I realized that the prison wasn't simply a structure of stone and steel. It was a vessel, holding memory, holding a life that had passed through it, holding the small, quiet horrors that no one had seen. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, night had fully settled. The moon cast pale light through the broken windows, illuminating the dust and debris. I stood for a moment, listening to the whispers fade into silence, and felt an odd calm. It wasn't relief, exactly, but a sense that I had witnessed something, had touched something that existed beyond the visible, something lingering from the lives once lived here. The echo of the past clung to me, subtle, persistent, a reminder that even in emptiness, this place remembered. And as I took a deep breath, preparing to move deeper into the prison, I realized that every step I had taken had been watched, every sound measured, every shadow recorded. The building was alive with memory, and I was now a part of it, if only for a fleeting moment. The whispers would fade, yes, but their weight, their presence would linger, following me down every corridor, brushing against me in every shadow, until I finally left the walls behind, or perhaps until they no longer let me go. I found the door at the end of the corridor almost by accident. It was narrower than the others, set slightly off the wall, and the handle was covered in layers of rust so thick it had become almost unrecognizable. A faint draft whispered out from the crack underneath, carried with it the cold, metallic scent of iron, dust, and something older I could not name. My hand hovered over the handle for a long moment, hesitating, aware of the silence pressing down from the walls around me. When I finally pushed, the door groaned a low, reluctant sound that echoed down the corridor and seemed to carry with a sigh, as though the building itself were aware of what was about to be disturbed. Inside, the room was small, no more than a single cell, and the shadows clung to the corners like living things. The air was colder here, heavier, almost thick enough to taste. I could see the faint outline of a narrow bed frame, still intact after decades, and the floor covered in dust and fragments of plaster that had fallen from the ceiling. I moved slowly, letting my flashlight glide over every surface. On the walls, faint scratches marked the stone, names and dates layered over one another in patterns that spoke of time and despair. Some markings were simple, initials carved with careful precision. Others were frantic, jagged letters that seemed to claw at the walls, a record of panic, anger, or hopelessness. I could almost hear the thoughts behind them. The endless hours, the isolation, the mind turning on itself when left alone with nothing but the sound of your own breathing. The bed was bare, save for a small, crumbling blanket that had been left in a corner. Its threads were loose and brittle, but I could see where someone had slept, curled into themselves, tried to stay warm, trying to disappear into the narrow space. Beside the bed, a small table remained, scarred with deep grooves and scratches. On it, scattered papers yellow with age, and a few letters folded carefully despite the decay around them. I picked one up, careful not to tear it further. The handwriting was delicate, cramped, almost too precise, as if the person had needed to maintain control in a life where control had been stripped away. The words were simple, almost mundane at first. I hope this reaches someone. But the subtext was undeniable. Each line carried a weight, a quiet despair that pressed against the chest as I read. There were mentions of regret, loneliness, and fear that stretched endlessly. They say the world outside forgets us. One line read, and I felt an ache in my chest, imagining the person who had written it, alone in the dim light, hoping against hope that someone would read these words, would remember. I set the letter down, letting my flashlight illuminate the walls once more. Graffiti and scratch messages covered nearly every surface. Some were names, some were confessions, and others were cries for help. I could imagine the person pacing this tiny room, marking days, keeping count of hours, tracing the shape of their own existence onto the walls. The repeated scratching sounded almost musical, a rhythm of isolation that I could feel in my own bones. There were small objects as well, remnants of a life constrained and confined. A cracked mug, a small tin cup with faded traces of tea, and a pencil stub, worn down from endless hours of writing. Each item seemed ordinary, almost trivial, but in this space it carried weight, carrying the ghost of someone who had been desperately clinging to small comforts. I picked up the pencil, rolling it between my fingers. I could imagine a hand that had held it, drawing shapes, writing letters, leaving marks that would outlast the person themselves. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I moved toward the back of the cell. In the corner, a small pile of papers lay stacked neatly, as though someone had taken care to keep them organized despite the decay around them. I flipped through them, careful not to disturb the fragile sheets. They were letters, notes, small journals, each one a glimpse into a mind trapped and pressed by solitude. Some were addressed to family, some to friends who may never have existed, and others simply to the world at large, as if the writer were speaking across time. I read a line that made me pause. I hear them at night, their footsteps, their voices. I am not alone, though I wish I were. I felt the words sink into me, an unsettling echo that mirrored my own presence here. I could hear the floorboards creak somewhere behind me. Though I knew the cell was empty, yet the sensation of being watched persisted, subtle but undeniable. The memory of those who had been here clung to the walls, lingering like smoke, brushing against my consciousness even as I tried to focus on the text before me. I moved closer to the bed, kneeling to inspect the mattress frame. It was rusted, but its shape was still clear, the metal cold and rough under my hands. I imagined someone lying there for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about freedom and punishment, imagining a world beyond these walls that they would never reach. The thought weighed on me heavily. It was more than sadness. It was a deep, gnawing sense of isolation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. A faint whisper brushed the edge of my hearing, almost imperceptible, like a memory brushing against reality. I froze, straining to listen, but there was nothing, only the building settling, only the small sound of my own breathing amplified by the oppressive quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that the room had been empty for decades, and yet I felt a subtle pulse of presence, a reminder that memory can linger long after the bodies are gone. I set the flashlight on the table, letting its light drift across the cell. The shadows seemed to shift slightly in response, dark corners stretching and bending as though reaching out to me. The graffiti on the walls became more than marks. They became voices, whispers of despair, fragments of lives that unfolded entirely within these four walls. The repeated scratching, the frantic scrawls, the careful notes, they all seemed to speak to me at once, telling a story I could almost comprehend, yet never fully understand. There was a small window near the ceiling, its glass mostly broken. The cold light from outside spilled in, creating thin bars of illumination across the floor and walls. I could see dust floating in the light, tiny particles that caught and held it like a faint shimmer. I imagined the hand that had pressed itself against the same glass, longing for sky, longing for freedom, tracing patterns with its fingers and leaving behind invisible memories that still lingered in the air. I lingered in the cell for what felt like hours, letting the atmosphere settle around me. The letters, the graffiti, the objects, they all combined into a tapestry of lived experience, pressing against me with a quiet intensity. There was no scream, no sudden shock, only the slow, inexorable weight of memory, of lives lived and lost in confinement. I felt a strained connection to them, a kinship of sorts, sharing the same moment in time across decades, breathing the same air, sensing the same walls closing in. Finally, I rose, taking one last look around the cell. The shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, the faint whisper of memory brushing at the edges of my mind. I knew I could not stay here forever, that I needed to move deeper into the building, but I carried the presence of this space with me, the locked memories of someone who had lived and suffered in silence. The feeling was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it stayed with me, pressing gently against my consciousness as I stepped back into the corridor. The door closed behind me with a soft, reluctant sigh, echoing down the hallway. For a moment, the corridor seemed emptier than before, but the weight of the solitary cell remained, a lingering reminder that even forgotten places hold stories that do not fade entirely. And as I walked on deeper into the heart of the prison, I could not shake the sense that somewhere in these walls, those memories were waiting, patient and persistent, whispering softly to anyone who would listen. The prison seemed different now that night had fully settled. The corridors I had walked during the fading light were no longer just dark. They were dense, heavy, as if the shadows themselves had substance. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, leaving most of the hallways swallowed in darkness. Every movement I made felt deliberate, measured, as if the building itself were judging the pace of my steps. I walked slowly, listening to the soft sounds that had begun to stir around me. A distant drip of water echoed through the empty halls, each drop landing with a hollow, resonant note that seemed to stretch far longer than physics would allow. Occasionally, I thought I heard a soft shuffle, a scrape of metal or a faint thud, and I had to remind myself it was only the old structure settling. But my mind kept painting images over these sounds. A pair of worn boots pacing, a figure shifting restlessly in a cell, a guard making his rounds in a place that had long forgotten its living occupants. The shadows stretched in impossible ways along the walls. Where a corridor had seemed straight in daylight, it now bent subtly, corners curling inward, giving the sense of depth where none should exist. I often caught myself glancing at the far end of a hallway, only to find the shadow there had shifted slightly while I looked elsewhere. It wasn't malice, not exactly, but a living presence of memory, something aware of me, tracing me with quiet patience. I paused near a cell with broken bars. My flashlight illuminated a narrow bed frame and a crumpled blanket that seemed to breathe faintly in the dim air, as if it remembered the way of the person who had lain there. I imagined them pacing the cell at night, tracing patterns on the walls, whispering softly into the darkness to keep the quiet at bay. The very air seemed to hold on to their murmurs, carrying them faintly to me. I could almost hear it, a low, rhythmic hum, the sound of someone counting the hours until morning, or perhaps until despair claimed them again. A soft creak somewhere above me made me start. I stopped, breath caught. The noise was brief, subtle, almost too quiet to be noticed, but my heart clenched in response. It could have been a loose shutter, a weakened floorboard, anything, but the sound echoed differently here. It carried intention, somewhere distant. It was almost like a voice calling, or someone whispering the wrong syllables of a familiar word. My ears strained, but nothing repeated. Still, the sensation remained. I was being watched, not just by the walls, but by the memories that clung stubbornly to them. I pressed forward, flashlight illuminating the peeling paint and rusted doors. The floor groaned under my weight, subtle but distinct, and I could hear the faintest scraping in time with my steps. I told myself it was the building reacting to my presence. Buildings make noises. Buildings settle. Buildings remember. But the feeling persisted, curling around my spine, sinking into my chest, and whispering that the prison had always been attentive, always listening. Some of the cells were empty, but others carried remnants of past lives. A desk in one corner held a broken pencil, and scraps of paper yellowed with age. I could imagine the inmates sitting there, whispering to themselves, writing letters they would never send, crafting messages to the outside world that might never be read. The shadows across the walls seemed to dance faintly with each imagined movement, long arms stretching across the cell like the hands of someone invisible, gesturing toward me. I paused in a particularly narrow corridor. The shadows here were thick and black, curling along the floor and up the walls. It felt like they were leaning toward me, not threatening, but aware. I could hear a faint whisper, almost indiscernible. It was syllables, fragments, perhaps a name. I froze, letting the sound wash over me. The whisper faded before I could focus on it, leaving only a residue of unease, a subtle pulse in my chest. I realized I was holding my breath without noticing. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my mind. Moving deeper into the cell block, I noticed that the air seemed colder, sharper, and more oppressive. Each step carried the echo of countless past movements, a rhythm of footsteps that I imagined alongside mine. I could almost see the figures. Prisoners shuffling from one cell to the next, guards walking the halls in slow, monotonous circuits, shadows rising to meet each other in the dim corners. The building was alive with repetition, a memory of routines etched into the walls themselves. I passed a row of cells that had small windows near the ceiling. The faint moonlight fell across the floor, illuminating dust motes that seemed to shimmer like tiny, restless spirits. I could imagine a prisoner pressing a hand against that glass, staring into the night sky, wishing for freedom, for escape, for something beyond the oppressive stone walls. I traced my fingers along the windowsill, feeling the cold, rough texture. The echoes of longing seemed to hang in the air, a weight pressing against my lungs. There was a faint scraping again, somewhere down the corridor. I stopped, flashlight sweeping slowly over each cell. Nothing moved, and yet the sound had come from precise direction, as if a person had walked across the floor, careful not to disturb the rest of the building. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to slow my breathing. The shadows stretched longer, darker. They seemed to watch me, following the sweep of my light, retreating just as I approached. I could hear murmurs now, closer, layered, overlapping, words that didn't make sense, fragment of conversation that had no context, just the impression of life continuing in isolation. I pressed my hand against the wall, feeling the rough, cold surface, imagining the generations of footsteps, of voices, of despair that had been held within. The whispers were not malicious. They were memory itself, pressing forward, brushing against me, leaving an impression of the countless lives that had been contained in this place. I moved carefully toward a cell at the far end of the corridor. It had been partially collapsed, debris scattered across the floor. My flashlight revealed a bed frame twisted with rust, a desk upturned, and scrawled writing across the walls. Some of the phrases were legible. I will not forget. The nights are long. I hear them, even now. The final line made me shiver. The words felt like they were not intended for me, yet somehow they reached me, carrying the faint pulse of presence that lingered in the air. I lingered there, letting the flashlight drift over graffiti, the bent metal, the dusty remnants of personal items. The whispers were faint, but persistent, brushing against my consciousness in a way that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I imagined the people who had been here, pacing their small spaces, speaking to shadows to keep themselves sane, leaving marks on the walls and objects in the hope that someone would notice, that someone would remember. Time seemed to stretch in the corridor. Every sound, every creak of metal or stone, took on significance. The shadows seemed to move almost independently, stretching unnaturally along the walls, curling at the corners, and occasionally seeming to follow my movement with subtle intent. I realized that the sense of being watched wasn't about a single entity. It was a collective memory of every person who had ever been here, condensed and pressing forward into the present, attentive to my intrusion. I stopped near a cell where the door had fallen off its hinges. The darkness inside seemed thicker than the rest, almost like a small void. I could hear the faintest murmur, a rhythm of breaths, soft but distinct. I could not see anyone. I could not even sense a shape. And yet, the feeling of observation was undeniable, as if something were crouched just beyond the light, studying me, patient, waiting. My pulse quickened, but I kept my movements slow, deliberate. I did not want to provoke whatever attention lingered here. Finally, I moved on, letting the flashlight sweep down the hallway. The whispers faded into background, lingering at the edges of perception, like a memory that refuses to die. The shadows stretched and contracted with my passing, curling along the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, always at the periphery of vision, always suggesting life where none should exist. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down, not menacingly, but insistently, reminding me that it was aware, that it remembered. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, I realized that the feeling of being watched had not left me. It had settled into my chest, a subtle, persistent pressure that reminded me I was not alone, that the prison itself and the memories it held had taken notice of my presence. The night had fully claimed the building, and though the air was still and the footsteps and murmurs seemed distant, I knew I was being observed, not by ghosts, not by spirits, but by the way of the countless lives that had unfolded here, echoing faintly into present. And so, as I paused to catch my breath, I felt the truth of it. This place would watch anyone who entered. It would measure their movements, count their steps, whisper in their ears, and leave them with the undeniable sensation of observation. I took a deep breath, pressing forward, knowing that the night had only just begun, and that the whispers, the shadows, and the memories would follow me into every corridor I entered until I left, or until I became another echo in its walls. The hallway leading to the warden's office smelled of dust and forgotten paper. The air was heavier here, thicker somehow, like it had absorbed decades of authority, discipline, and unspoken fear. I paused outside the door, hand resting lightly on the tarnished brass handle. The room beyond was supposed to be empty, abandoned for years, but the sense of presence pressed against me, subtle and insistent. I could almost feel the weight of someone watching from the shadows, waiting for me to step inside. I opened the door slowly. The hinges groaned, sending a long, low echo down the corridor behind me. Inside, the office was dim, lit only by the faint moonlight streaming through the cracked windows. Dust floated in the air, catching the beams of my flashlight like tiny ghosts, swirling silently in place. Everything was still, yet alive in its own way, as if the objects themselves remembered who had touched them last. The first thing I noticed was a desk. It was massive, dark with scar with years of use, its surface littered with papers yellowed by time. Ledgers, reports, and notebooks lay scattered across it, some open, some closed, their edges curling and brittle. I knelt to examine one of the open ledgers. The handwriting was precise, meticulous. Records of prisoners, dates of arrival, punishments assigned. The details were clinical, detached, yet I felt a shiver at the thought of the lives behind those numbers. Every mark told a story, some mundane, others unbearable, each bound by rules and procedures that shaped misery. Beside the ledgers lay a small tray of keys. Each one was different, rusted iron, worn brass, some with tags that had long since faded into obscurity. I picked one up, feeling the cold metal press into my palm. I imagined the warden's hand, heavier, more decisive, closing the lock on a cell door, confining a person within its walls for hours, maybe days, maybe longer. It was ordinary, the act of turning a key, but in this context, it was also something else, a small instrument control of authority that could not be questioned. I moved slowly around the office, letting my flashlight illuminate the shelves along the walls. Faded photographs sat crookedly in frames, faces of men and women staring back with neutral expressions, though I imagined their eyes followed me, alert and wary. Documents pinned to corkboard showed schedules, rosters, and cryptic notes. Some notes were mundane, reminders about inspections or visitor logs. Others were more unsettling, hastily written in pencil, lines crossed out and rewritten. I read a few aloud to myself, letting the quiet draw me in. Solitary at dusk. Ensure compliance. Report the prisoner's agitation. Take notes. Don't forget. Each phrase left a faint pressure on my chest, the kind of pressure that comes from realizing how deliberate someone's cruelty can be when it is methodical, disciplined, and hidden behind routine. There were small personal items too. A cup with dried residue inside, a pen chewed at the end, a single shoe polished to a dull shine. I could picture the warden sitting here at night, reviewing notes, counting keys, planning, organizing punishments that would follow like clockwork. The thought of it, so precise and unflinching, left me unsettled in a way I couldn't entirely explain. The objects were banal, yet they spoke of human behavior at its most controlled, most exacting. I picked up another key, smaller and more delicate than the others. The metal was cold against my skin, etched to the faint remnants of a tag. I imagined the door that opened, the cell that locked, the person on the other side, counting hours and listening to the world move without them. The thought was vivid, pressing into my mind, and I had to set the key down to steady my thoughts. The office felt alive around me. It wasn't haunted in traditional sense, but it carried memory, presence, a lingering tension that could not be ignored. On the floor near a cabinet, I noticed a stack of notebooks tied together with frayed string. I picked them up carefully. Each one contained detailed logs, daily report of the prisoners, records of infractions, notes on behavior, observations written in small, careful handwriting. As I flipped through them, I saw notes that hinted at punishments that were never formally documented. Lines like, left alone for 36 hours, observed quietly, no food for 2 days, ensure compliance. Even without dramatic words, the meaning was clear. These weren't just logs. They were records of deliberate control, of suffering codified and preserved. I felt the chill deepen in the room, a subtle shift in the air that made me pull my jacket tighter around myself. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching in ways that seemed unnatural. I thought I saw a flicker of movement, something just beyond the reach of my flashlight. But when I focused, nothing was there. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was a mind filling the emptiness. But the sense of being watched persisted, unrelenting and patient. On one wall, a corkboard displayed a jumble of keys and tags. I leaned closer, examining them. Each tag had a code, a number, a date. I could see how carefully the warden had tracked every access point, every lock, every potential restriction. I imagined the sound of the keys jangling, the deliberate rhythm of them being placed on a tray, selected with precision. Even in this silence, I could almost hear it, a faint, methodical clink that echoed in my imagination, marking order, control, authority. I moved toward a small cabinet in the corner. Its drawers creaked as I opened them. Inside were more documents, reports of complaints, letters from families, internal memos. Some were brief, factual, and mundane. Others hinted at something darker. Notes about prisoners disappearing for short periods, unusual restrictions, unexplained absences. I felt my stomach tighten as I read, imagining what must have occurred behind the closed doors of the prison, out of sight and record. The ordinary, after all, could conceal the extraordinary cruelty. The shadows deepened further as I examined a shelf lined with small boxes. Inside were tokens of authority, more keys, a small gavel, slips of paper detailing various punishments. I handled them gently, feeling the cold metal and brittle paper. The room seemed to hum faintly with memory, the weight of all that had been enacted here pressing subtly against me. I could almost sense the rhythm of the warden's day. Morning inspections, afternoon reports, evening preparations, the quiet moments spent planning, observing, recording. A draft moved through the office, carrying with it the faintest sound of whispering. I froze. There was no one there, only the room, empty and still, yet alive with the echoes of what had once occurred. I leaned against the desk, trying to steady my breathing. The whispers didn't form words, only impressions, traces of voices carried on the edges of memory, as though the building remembered its master and his authority. And now it remembered me. I set the last of the notebooks down, letting my flashlight drift over the office one more time. The shadows clung to the corners, stretching unnaturally, pressing toward me without threat, but with undeniable awareness. I could see every object differently now, not just as relics of man who had once ruled the space, but as vessels for the echoes of those who had endured his rules. The keys, the ledgers, the notes, they were all small instruments of memory and control, subtle reminders that the weight of authority persists long after its holder is gone. The office seemed to exhale slowly, the shadows relaxing just enough for me to take a step back. I realized that the room itself was patient, holding its secrets carefully, allowing only glimpses, fragments, impressions. It had no need for sudden movements or loud disturbances. The quiet, the subtle shift in air, the careful arrangement of objects, it was enough to leave a lasting impression on anyone who entered, anyone who dared to witness the lingering presence of methodical, deliberate human authority. Finally, I turned toward the door, pause and take one last look. The ledgers, the keys, the cryptic notes, they all remained exactly as they had been, frozen in their small universe of control and memory. I stepped out into the corridor, letting the office settle behind me. The echoes of its presence lingered in my mind, a quiet pressure that pressed against my thoughts and left me with the understanding that I had glimpsed something older, more deliberate, and more unsettling than I could have imagined. Even as I moved away, the weight of the office remained, the sense of observation and control following me down the hallway. The keys in the dark, the ledgers, the notes, they whispered their quiet stories into the shadows, and I knew, in that lingering silence, that the warden's presence was not gone. It had simply hidden itself, waiting for someone else to notice. The hallway stretched before me like a vein of darkness, cold and silent, yet vibrating with a quiet energy that made my chest tighten. Each step I took seemed to echo in perfect rhythm of my own heartbeat, a dull, insistent thump that blended with the groan of the floorboards beneath my boots. I told myself it was nothing, the building settling, the wooden floors reacting to the night, but the sensation of presence was unmistakable. It pressed against me softly, like a shadow brushing my shoulder, unseen but tangible. I paused, letting the flashlight rest on the cracked walls. The paint was peeling, curling in thin strips that floated slightly with the faint currents of air. The shadows clung to the corners in uneven shapes, long and thin at first, then curling thickly toward the floor, as if reaching for something just beyond reach. I could almost hear whispers brushing the edges of my mind, fragments of conversations, muffled laughter, or perhaps the soft, resigned sighs of those who had walked the same corridor decades ago. A creak echoed ahead of me, soft, deliberate. I froze, heart skipping a beat. The sound didn't match the rhythm of my own steps, and yet it mirrored it somehow, offset by a fraction of a second. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. It could be the floorboards, the walls, anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was moving to the hall just beyond the edges of my vision. The thought made the hairs on my neck rise, an instinctive warning, even as curiosity drove me forward. I moved carefully, footstep by measured footstep, letting the flashlight sweep over the floor, the walls, the doors lining the corridor. Some of the cells were empty, their doors hanging ajar, dark hollows yawning at me. Others seemed to hold remnants of life paused. A small desk tipped to one side, a chair still tucked against the wall, faint marks etched into the stone floor where someone had paced endlessly. I could imagine the prisoners shuffling in their tiny spaces, the guards walking silently past, the routines repeating over and over like some endless, invisible metronome. There was a faint metallic clink somewhere behind me. I stopped again, ears straining. My own breath sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. I slowly turned, flashlight cutting across the hall, but saw nothing. Only the empty corridor, stretching into darkness ahead. And yet, the sensation of being watched was stronger than before, pressing subtly into my back, around my sides, following me without movement, without sound. I felt the weight of eyes that weren't there, and the building seemed to hum faintly with attention. The floor groaned under my next step, a long, resonant sound that lingered in the air. Immediately, I thought I heard a faint echo behind it, softer, delayed, as if someone or something had mirrored my movement. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize it, telling myself the building was old. That would react to weight. that sounds travel strangely through these stone walls. But the rhythm persisted, subtle yet deliberate, a repetition that could not be explained entirely by natural means. I pressed forward. The flashlight beam caught glimpses of the walls, scratched initials, dates, hastily carved messages. Some were simple. Initials, numbers, short phrases that suggested boredom or resignation. Others were longer, desperate in tone. I am alone. No one remembers me. I hear them walking, always walking. The last phrase struck me with sudden clarity. Perhaps it had been written by someone who had felt what I was feeling now. The unseen presence. The faint echo of footsteps not their own. The invisible audience watching silently from the shadows. I moved past a row of small windows near the ceiling, their glass mostly broken. Moonlight spilled through, illuminating dust that floated in motes, shimmering like tiny, restless spirits. The shadows shifted with each movement of my flashlight, lengthening and curling, as if they had a life of their own. I could imagine a prisoner pressing a hand against that glass, watching the night sky, counting the hours until the footsteps outside the cell became unbearable. I pressed my hand to the windowsill, cold and rough, imagining the weight of someone leaning there, silent, isolated, aching to be free. Another creak echoed, closer this time. I stopped, flashlight scanning the hall. The shadows seemed to twitch in response, stretching slightly, then receding. My heart pounded. The building was still empty. There could be no one here, but I couldn't shake the feeling of movement just beyond my perception. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this place was old, that noises traveled strangely in abandoned buildings, that my imagination was prone to exaggeration, and yet the rhythm persisted, mirroring my heartbeat, echoing it back at me in small, subtle delays that made my skin prickle. I reached a corner and hesitated. The hallway bent at a right angle, fading into darkness. I imagined the steps ahead, soft, deliberate, like mine, yet not mine. I imagined someone pacing the hall long ago, counting seconds and minutes, marking each step, leaving their presence in a pattern that echoed across decades. I felt it now, that same rhythm brushing my awareness, brushing against my mind with soft insistence. I could almost hear them whispering behind the walls, faint, indecipherable murmurs that seemed meant only for me. I pressed forward again, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The floorboards groaned, the walls whispered, the shadows danced. Every detail seemed magnified. The peeling paint, the rusted hinges, the faint outlines of long-forgotten doors. I could see tiny scratches on the wood, where someone had dragged a chair, small indentations in the stone, where someone had pressed their hands, and the lingering echoes of footsteps long gone. The hallways themselves felt alive, shifting subtly as I moved, as if aware of my presence and responding in kind. A soft breeze brushed my face. I had no idea where it came from. The windows were mostly sealed, the walls thick, yet it moved through the corridor, carrying with it faint, whispering tones, almost like fragments of words. I stopped, letting the air brush past me. The whispers faded almost immediately, leaving only the resonance in my mind, the impression of voices without sound, movement without form, the sensation of being observed pressed closer, more deliberate, insistent yet subtle, like a presence just out of reach. I approached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. The shadows near them seemed thicker, darker, pooling in the corners like ink. I could hear the faintest scratching, a subtle rhythm like fingernails tracing across stone. I froze, listening. The sound matched my heartbeat again, just slightly delayed, a faint echo, a trace of life that should not exist. I felt the walls press inward, not physically, but in awareness, as if they remembered every person who had walked this hall and now remembered me. I moved closer, flashlight sweeping across the doors. Rust and decay lined the edges, small locks still intact, and the metal reflected the dim light in dull glints. I imagined the warden walking this hall long ago, keys jingling in hand, steps deliberate, authoritative, marking the path of control. The rhythm was different, yet familiar. It was measured, exact like mine, yet not mine, an echo of authority, of observation, of attention that persisted long after the building was abandoned. I stepped past the doors, into the wider corridor beyond. The shadows stretched impossibly, curling along the walls, following my every movement. The faint echo of footsteps continued, now layered over my own, tracing patterns I could not predict. I realized then that the building had a memory, a rhythm of its own. Every creak, every whisper, every shifting shadow was part of it. I was no longer just walking through an empty hall. I was walking through the recollections of everyone who had ever occupied this space. I paused to breathe, feeling the subtle pressure presence all around. The whispers were faint now, almost imperceptible, yet their persistence was undeniable. I could sense eyes tracking me from the darkness, not malicious, but aware, attentive, patient. I understood then that I was not alone in this hallway. I never had been, and I would not be. The echoes of those who had walked these halls before me lingered, pressing into the present, watching silently as I moved. And as I continued forward, each step deliberate and measured, I realized something unsettling. The hallway would always remember me. The echoes would follow. The shadows would stretch. And the rhythm of footsteps, my own and theirs, would linger long after I had left. I could not see them, could not touch them, and perhaps they were nothing at all. But the sensation of being watched, the quiet insistence of memory and presence, pressed inescapably into my mind. The corridor seemed endless, each step merging with the next, heartbeat and echo entwined. The night had claimed the prison entirely, yet was alive in memory, in whisper, in shadow. And I, intruder and witness, moved slowly through it, carrying the weight of attention, the soft, persistent presence that would not let me go. I reached the end of the hallway and found it blocked by a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and darkened by decades of neglect. The lock was rusted solid, yet it seemed to possess a kind of finality, an unspoken barrier meant to keep whatever lay inside contained and hidden. I ran my fingers along the warped wood, feeling the uneven grooves, the way it resisted my touch as though it knew it had secrets it didn't want to release. The air around the door was colder than anywhere else in the corridor. I noticed my breath fogging slightly, and I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the room itself was holding its breath. I crouched, I leveled with the lock, and examined it carefully. Years of rust had fused the mechanism, but the keyhole seemed untouched, still capable of opening with the right key. I imagined the warden years ago, carrying the key on a heavy ring, pausing here to glance down the hall before turning it, sealing something away from a world. I found one of the small keys I had collected from his office, testing each one with meticulous care. Finally, a thin brass key slid into the lock with a reluctant click. The door shivered slightly, as if waking after long sleep, and I could feel a subtle vibration beneath my fingertips, like a heartbeat that belonged to the building itself. I took a slow breath, steadying my shaking hands, and turned the key. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a room swallowed in darkness. My flashlight beam revealed a small, square space, cluttered with the debris of years, broken furniture, stacks of papers, and a thick layer of dust covering every surface. But the details that drew my attention most were the objects arranged with care, as though someone had paused their work and intended to return. A chair sat upright near the center, its legs balanced precariously on the uneven floor. Papers were stacked neatly on a desk, a ledger lying open as if someone had been writing only moments ago, though decades had passed. I stepped inside, feeling the chill of the room deepen as I moved. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, carried with a faint scent of mildew, ink, and something darker I could not name. My flashlight illuminated a set of files tucked into a cabinet along the far wall. I approached slowly, each step creaking loudly against the wooden floor, echoing off the walls. The files were labeled with dates and prisoner numbers, meticulously cataloged. Yet, buried within the ordinary records, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A file labeled in a hurried scrawl that read simply, "Case closed, 1947. I opened it with care, the pages brittle and yellowed. Inside were details that should have been mundane. Reports of prison incidents, routine observations, daily logs. But tucked between the typed pages were handwritten notes, written in the warden's precise, deliberate style. The words hinted at a crime that had never been solved, a death that had been quietly recorded and then hidden. One line struck me particularly. Inmate found in cell, circumstances suspicious, reported as accidental. Observation ongoing. Observation, I realized, meant control, oversight, and secrecy. I traced the words with my finger, imagining the scene behind them. A prisoner, alone in a cell, something going wrong, and no one outside understanding, no one outside caring. I could feel the weight of it, pressing against the walls of the room and seeping into my chest. The silence of the place amplified the memory, made it intimate, almost tangible. It was as if the room itself wanted me to understand the gravity of what had been concealed here. I moved to the desk, scanning the other papers scattered there. They were notes, small fragments, details that seemed insignificant at first. A misplaced watch, a missing key, a guard's brief mention of seeing something unusual. But together, they formed a pattern, a quiet record of wrongdoing that had never been acknowledged. I felt a chill run down my spine. The crime had been buried under routine, hidden by the mundane, and yet here it was, waiting for someone to notice. I found more items tucked into corners of the room. A small box of personal belongings, faded photographs, a wallet long forgotten. Each object carried a story of its owner, of lives intersecting with tragedy and silence. I picked up a photograph, the paper fragile in my hand. It showed a group of men in uniform, smiling faintly at the camera, yet one figure's eyes caught me. There was a depth of fear there, a subtle tension that seemed to radiate across decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person in the photograph had been aware of something no one else had noticed, something that led to their untimely disappearance. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken as I moved. My flashlight beam bounced over the walls, revealing scratches, subtle marks, and faded messages that had been left in the margins of ledgers. Some were notes to oneself, others to someone unseen. Do not speak of this. He watches even now. The words pressed into my mind, merging with my imagination to create a sense of the unseen, a presence that lingered, attentive and patient. I turned back to the cabinet, drawn to a drawer that had been partially forced open at some point. Inside were documents labeled with names, dates, and small annotations. One page in particular caught my eye, a report noting a prisoner's disappearance under unusual circumstances, followed by a single line, almost a whisper in ink. The truth lies behind closed doors. I swallowed hard, the words sticking to my throat. The implication was clear, yet the details remained frustratingly out of reach. I could feel the room's weight pressing closer. It was no longer just an empty space. It was a container of guilt, secrecy, and the echoes of someone else's choices. My flashlight illuminated a corner where the floorboards had been scratched deeply, a small indentation pressed into wood where a person had knelt, perhaps searching, perhaps hiding. I imagined their fear, the careful calculation of every movement, the quiet terror of being unseen yet observed. A faint draft stirred, brushing against my face, carrying a whisper I could not decipher. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a sound that could be explained by the building's settling, nor a trick of the air. It felt intentional, a subtle reminder that someone or something was aware of my presence. I could feel eyes on me, unseen but certain, lingering at the edges of my perception. The sense of guilt pressed in, though it was not mine, not directly. It was the guilt of witnessing, of intruding on something meant to remain hidden, of acknowledging the presence of past wrongs. I moved slowly toward the center of the room, letting my flashlight drift over the scattered debris. Papers, ledgers, boxes, photographs. They all bore the same weight. Reminders of lives touched by secrecy, lives contained, controlled, and silenced. I imagined the warden moving through this very room, keys jangling, eyes scanning, ensuring that every detail was accounted for, that every misstep was contained. The thought sent a subtle shiver through me. Authority could persist long after the person wielding it was gone, and here it had. I picked up another photograph. Smaller this time, a single prisoner posed against the wall of a cell. There was something haunting in the eyes, a quiet resignation mixed with fear. I traced the edge of the photo with my fingertip. Decades had passed, yet the emotion remained vivid, pressing forward through time, insisting on recognition. I realized then that the room itself was a witness, holding on to these fragments and presenting them slowly, deliberately, to anyone willing to look. The shadows seemed to shift as I moved, curling along the walls and floor in unnatural patterns. I thought I glimpsed movement in the corner of my vision, an eye, a flash of recognition, a fleeting sense of being observed. I could not turn quickly enough, and when I looked again, there was nothing, only shadows, dense and patient, lingering just out of reach. I knew the feeling was real, not imaginary. Something was watching me, aware of my intrusion, aware that I had unlocked what had been sealed for decades. I gathered a few of the files, pressing them gently to my chest. Their weight was physical, but also emotional, a subtle pull that pressed on my conscience. I felt the room's quiet insistence, the lingering presence of the past reminding me that some doors, once open, leave a trace that cannot be erased. The crime, whatever it had been, left more than history behind. It left memory, observation, and the faint echo of guilt that reaches across time. I stepped back toward the door, leaving the room slowly, deliberately. The shadows followed me, stretching, curling, attentive. I realized I had carried the room's weight into the hallway, that the presence I had disturbed would linger, observing, patient, subtle, insistent. Even as I closed the door behind me with a careful push, the sense of unseen eyes remained, pressing gently against my mind. Walking down the hallway, I felt a quiet heaviness, an intimate connection to what I had witnessed. The locked door had revealed more than documents and photographs. It had revealed memory, secrecy, and the subtle horror of lives touched by control, hidden from the world. The building itself seemed to hum softly with recognition, attentive and patient, carrying the echoes of crime forward, into the present, into my awareness. Even now, as I write this in the safety of daylight, I can feel it pressing in, faint but undeniable. The presence of eyes that will not be seen, the weight of memory that will not be forgotten, the lingering sense of guilt for simply knowing what had been concealed for so long. The air inside the prison was thick and heavy, carrying a scent that clung to the back of my throat. Iron, mildew, and the faint tang of old sweat. I stepped into the first row of cells, my boots echoing against the cracked stone floor. Each step seemed louder than the last, reverberating through the empty hall, like a metronome counting the absence of life. The place was still, yet it held a weight, a quiet oppression that pressed against my chest. The cells themselves were lined with rusted bars, their iron twisted and pitted by decades of neglect. The metal was rough beneath my fingers, and I traced the cool surface slowly, imagining the hands that had been forced against it long ago. I pictured the prisoners staring out, pressed close to the bars, eyes filled with longing, fear, or defiance. Some of them had surely marked the bars with scratches, tiny evidence of existence, little declarations that they had been here, that they had survived, or at least endured. I paused at a cell closest to the corner. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and I could see the floor inside was scratched and worn in a pattern that suggested pacing. Dust had settled in the grooves, but the marks were persistent, almost as if the weight of countless footsteps had embedded themselves into the stone. I imagined the rhythm, back and forth, counting hours, days, perhaps weeks, until the monotony became a companion as real as any person. The walls of the cells were covered with graffiti, faded and peeling with age. Some were simple initials, dates, or crude sketches. Others were longer, desperate messages. I am still here. They will not forget me. Time moves slowly, but I endure. I read them aloud in whispers, letting the words settle in the room, feeling their weight. Each phrase was a fragment of life trapped within these walls, a memory pressed into stone, refusing to fade entirely. I moved deeper into the block, flashlight in hand, letting the beam sweep slowly across the rows of cells. Shadows stretched long and thin along the walls, curling at the corners in strange, unnatural shapes. I imagined the prisoners leaning against these walls, whispering softly to themselves to pass the time, leaving small marks, scratches, or notes, hoping that someone, anyone, might notice. The thought pressed on me with a subtle, insistent unease, like the building itself was reminding me of its past. The bars groaned slightly as I ran my hand along them. Rust flakes fell onto the floor, tiny brown fragments that scattered with a delicate clink. I imagined the sound echoing to the hall decades ago, the clatter of keys and locks, the scraping of feet against stone, the whispered conversations in dim, cold cells. The metal had borne witness to all of it, the authority, the punishment, the long, grinding hours of confinement. Some cells were empty, stripped of all furnishings except for a cot or a chair. Others still held remnants of life, a tattered blanket, a broken book, scraps of paper with faint writing. I bent down to pick up one of these pieces. It was a small slip, yellowed and frayed, with barely legible words. Remember me. The message was simple, almost naive, yet it carried the weight of desperation. I could feel the presence behind it. The quiet insistence of someone who had existed here, whose life had been constrained to these walls, whose voice had only left traces like this one. I continued walking slowly, pausing at each cell to let my eyes absorb the details. The cold stone, the rusted bars, the graffiti, the remnants of personal belongings. They were all fragments of human experience, frozen in time. And yet, they were not entirely dead. There was a pulse in the air, subtle but undeniable, a sense that the memories of those who had been confined here clung to the walls, pressing forward just enough to make their presence known. At one point, I paused near a cell with a small, broken window. Moonlight spilled in, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. I pressed my hand against the cold stone sill, imagining the prisoner who had stared out into the night sky, counting the stars, dreaming of freedom, of escape, of a world beyond these walls. The cell had been a cage, but it had also been a witness, absorbing the small gestures, the whispers, the tiny act of rebellion or hope. The hallway creaked softly behind me. I froze, straining to hear. Perhaps it was the building settling, or perhaps a gust of wind moving through broken windows. But the sound seemed deliberate, almost as if the prison itself had noticed my presence. My heartbeat quickened, and I slowed my steps, letting the silence stretch, listening for anything beyond the natural sounds of decay. The air felt heavier now, as if filled with attention, as though every shadow and bar remembered the countless eyes that had once scanned this corridor, searching for movement, for defiance, for life. I reached a cell whose door had fallen off its hinges entirely. Inside, the floor was worn smooth by years of pacing. The walls were etched with marks that looked like attempts at communication, letters, numbers, symbols whose meanings had faded over time. I ran my fingers across them, feeling the grooves, tracing the shapes slowly. I imagined the person who had made these marks, the hours they had spent pressing into the stone, leaving a trace of their existence in a place designed to erase it. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it a whisper sound that made me flinch. It was impossible to tell where it came from. No windows nearby, no draft in the corridor. The whisper was not a word, not a phrase, but a subtle brush of movement, like someone breathing just beyond my perception. I reminded myself that I was alone, and yet the sensation of unseen eyes lingered, watching, patient, subtle, pressing gently against my awareness. I continued down the hallway, flashlight illuminating each cell with slow, deliberate sweeps. I noticed small details that made the space feel alive. Scratches on the floorboard where chairs had been dragged, faint stains on the stone, the warped edges of metal bars that had bent slightly over decades. Every object carried memory, and every shadow seemed to shift with the motion of my light. It was not a haunting in the traditional sense, but the weight of experience pressed against me like a living thing. At the end of the row, I found a cell with a particularly dense layer of dust on the floor. I could see the impressions of footsteps that had pressed into it long ago, patterns of movement that suggested pacing, waiting, counting. I knelt to examine them, tracing the marks with my fingers. The rhythm of the past echoed faintly in my mind, back and forth, a repetition that stretched across decades. I felt a strange kinship, a connection across time with the person who had moved here, marking their own presence in a place meant to suppress it. I stood and moved on, letting my flashlight drift over the final cells. The shadows were long now, curling in strange, unnatural shapes along the walls. I could hear the faintest echoes of creaking, of metal shifting, of dust settling. Perhaps it was all my imagination, my mind filling in the silence. But I could not shake the sense of attention, of awareness, of something watching me from just beyond the edges of perception. The cells were empty, yet they were not entirely vacant. Finally, I paused in the center of the block, taking a long, slow breath. The air was heavy, rusted, and metallic, carrying the faint residue of decades of confinement. I let the flashlight drift across the room one last time, letting the beams settle on the bars, the graffiti, the remnants of life pressed into stone. Each detail seemed to pulse faintly, like a memory that refuses to fade. like a presence that lingers quietly, observing, patient, unbroken by the passage of time. I stepped back toward the hallway, leaving the cells behind. The sense of weight lingered, pressing gently against my chest, reminded me that the space was not truly empty. Rust and chains, scratches and whispers, the long-forgotten traces of human lives. They were all still here, patient, subtle, persistent. And I knew, even as I walked away, that the prison had not let me go. Its memory, its presence, its quiet attention would follow me, just as it followed everyone who had passed through these halls before me. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with the same rusted bars I had touched the night before. The silence was different now. It wasn't simply empty. It felt like it was waiting, expectant, holding something just beyond perception. As I walked, I became aware of a subtle shift in the air, a presence that pressed lightly, insistently, against my awareness. My own breathing seemed too loud, each inhale echoing in the narrow hallway like a bell tolling in a forgotten cathedral. I reached a row of cells that seemed smaller than the others, low ceilings and cramped floors. The walls were scarred and scratched, graffiti etched into stone with hurried, desperate hands. Some messages were simple, initials, numbers, a date. Others carried weight I could almost feel. Do not leave me here. I am still alive. They cannot hear me, but I remember. I whispered these words aloud, letting them settle into quiet, even spoken softly. They press against me, a reminder that lives had once moved here, constrained, constrained, constrained. As I moved down the hallway, I began to notice something else. Faint murmurs, almost imperceptible, seemed to drift from the cells themselves. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing, yet something was there, a subtle layering of sound, like echoes of voices from decades past, carried through the stone walls. Words that were never clear, never complete, but full of emotion. Fear, loneliness, defiance, sorrow. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the stories of those confined within them, and were now replaying fragments for anyone who dared to listen. I let the flashlight drift along the bars, pausing at each cell. Some were empty, stripped of all belongings. Others held remnants of life. Tattered blankets, scraps of paper, faint marks on the floor where someone had paced endlessly. I imagined the rhythm of their days, counting hours and minutes, marking each step against the unyielding stone. Every creak in the floor, every rustle of metal, every distant echo could have been a whisper from a ghost, or a memory imprinted so deeply it refused to fade. One cell caught my attention. The bars were bent slightly, as if someone had leaned against them for years, pressing, pushing, enduring. Inside, the floor was worn into a subtle pattern, a silent map of countless hours spent moving back and forth, back and forth. I knelt, letting my fingers trace the grooves, feeling the cold stone beneath my hand. I imagined the person who had walked here, thinking, remembering, dreaming of freedom, wondering if the walls themselves remembered their presence. The murmurs grew more distinct as I continued. They were not words I could fully comprehend, not names or sentences, but they carried emotion, tone, subtle inflections of desperation, resignation, and quiet endurance. I could feel them in my chest, pressing lightly against my ribs, a weight I could not dismiss. It was as though the prisoners had left traces of their inner lives here, fragment of thought and feeling that the building held on to, refusing to release entirely. I pressed on, flashlight illuminating scratches and marks etched into the walls. Some were crude and frantic, others deliberate, almost meditative. They told stories, brief impressions of rebellion, fear, longing. A pattern began to emerge, subtle but unmistakable. Each cell was a capsule of experience, every mark a testament to endurance, every whisper a residual echo of the human spirit constrained within these walls. The air was cooler here, denser, carrying the faintest scent of decay mixed with the metallic tang of rust. I shivered involuntarily and pulled my jacket closer. My footsteps seemed too loud, too deliberate, and I imagined the prisoners hearing them, counting them, fearing them, or perhaps using them to mark the passage of time. The corridor seemed to pulse in response, a living reminder that memory is not bound by the present. At a bend in the hall, I paused. A low, soft murmur brushed against my mind, almost like a sigh. I froze, flashlight hovering over the bars. The sound was faint, fleeting, yet undeniably present. I couldn't place it, couldn't name it, yet it carried meaning. A small fragment of a life, a thought, a fear pressed into stone so long ago that it had become part of the building itself. I pressed my palm to the cool iron bars and whispered, "I hear you." The murmur seemed to respond, if only in tone, in cadence, an almost imperceptible rise and fall that mirrored my heartbeat. I walked slowly, deliberately, letting the light brush over the walls, the floors, the etched marks of time. Each step seemed to draw more fragments into awareness. Tiny details I hadn't noticed before. A small indentation where someone knelt to pray. A line scratched across the wall with numbers that might have been counting days or hours. Faint smudges where hands had rested for minutes, perhaps hours. I felt an odd kinship, a fragile connection across time with those who had moved through this space before me. Their experiences, their suffering, their endurance. It pressed on me subtly, gently, like the weight of a whispering wind. I could feel their presence in the still air, in the way shadows pulled in corners, in the rhythm of my own steps echoing theirs. It was an intimacy I hadn't expected, the sense of being part of a long chain of quiet observation and endurance. A door at the end of the corridor caught my attention. It was smaller, reinforced, and heavily worn. I approached slowly, flashlight sweeping over its surface. Faint scratches suggested it had been forced or leaned against many times. A soft sigh of air came from beneath it, as though the room itself was breathing. I imagined prisoners pressed close to this door, listening, hoping, fearing, counting the seconds until it would open or close, until the next steps in the hall echoed past them. The murmurs grew again, faint but insistent. They were layered now, overlapping, like fragments of multiple conversations pressed together. I could feel the emotional weight of it, the fear, the hope, the quiet desperation of so many people whose voices had never been heard. It pressed gently against me, and I had to stop walking, letting it wash over me. I closed my eyes briefly and breathed slowly, trying to absorb it without being overwhelmed. Opening my eyes, I noticed more details. Small scratches forming words I hadn't seen before, lines of faded text that spoke of loneliness, endurance, and quiet rebellion. The cells were not just containers. They were repositories of memory, each marking the passage of lives in subtle, often overlooked ways. The whispers and murmurs were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were echoes of experience, faint reminders that lives, even when constrained, leave traces behind. I moved forward slowly, flashlight beam wavering. The weight of the murmurs pressed against my chest, and I realized the corridor itself had absorbed them, preserved them, and now offered them to me in fragments. I felt a quiet humility in their presence, an acknowledgement of my intrusion into their solitude. And yet, there was no hostility, only awareness, patient and lingering. By the time I reached the end of the row, I felt a subtle change in the air. The murmurs faded to almost nothing, replaced by the faint creaking of the building settling, the soft echo of my own breathing. I paused, letting the silence stretch, listening for anything beyond it. The corridor seemed to hold its breath with me, patient, aware, persistent. I could feel unseen eyes tracking me, not with menace, but with quiet attention, a lingering presence that would not leave entirely. As I turned back to continue exploring, I understood the nature of this place. It was not haunted in the way stories tell, with shadows leaping or sudden shrieks. Its haunting was subtler, slower, a deep, enduring impression of lives once lived, struggles quietly endured, and voices that refused to vanish entirely. The cells held memory, the walls held emotion, and I, moving among them, became part of the ongoing echo. Even now, as I walked past the bars one final time, I could feel the weight of it pressing lightly on me. The murmurs were faint, almost gone, but the emotional resonance lingered, settling into my chest, into my thoughts, into the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The prisoner's experiences were etched into the very fabric of the prison, lingering in a quiet, patient, persistent way that memory refuses to fade. I stepped out of the row of cells and let the hallway stretch behind me, shadows curling at the corners, the weight of past voices following softly, just beyond perception. And I knew that wherever I went next, the corridor would remember, the whispers would continue, and the emotional weight of solitude would linger, subtle and persistent, like a faint pulse in the walls themselves. I came across a door that was different from the others. Unlike the rows I had already walked, this one looked untouched, as if it had been deliberately sealed, ignored by the passage of time and the decay of the building. Its hinges were thick with rust, and the wood had darkened to a dull, almost black tone. The lock was heavy, and for a moment I hesitated. There was a weight here, subtle and insistent, that pressed on my chest. It was more than metal and wood. It felt like a barrier holding not just a space, but memory itself. I found the key I had taken from the warden's old office, turning it slowly in the lock. It resisted at first, then gave way with a groan that sounded louder than it should have, echoing down the empty hallway. I felt a shiver crawl along my spine as I pushed the door open. The air that escaped was colder than the hallway, thick with dust and a faint tang of something metallic. I stepped inside carefully, letting the beam of my flashlight sweep across the room. The cell was small, the stone walls rough and uneven, corners darkened by years of neglect. A thin layer of dust covered everything, yet the faint outlines of objects beneath suggested life had once been here. My eyes fell first on a cot in the corner, the mattress long gone, leaving only a frame that creaked faintly under my touch. The floor around it was worn, scratched, as if someone had paced endlessly, measuring time in steps back and forth, back and forth. I could almost feel the rhythm of those days pressing against me, quiet and relentless. I approached the walls and let my fingers trace the scratches carved into the stone. Some were simple initials, letters, or numbers. Small attempt at leaving a mark, asserting existence. Others were longer, desperate messages, barely legible after decades of decay. I am here. Do not forget me. They watch. They see. My throat tightened as I read the words, and I whispered them softly, letting them settle in the quiet air. It was as though the walls themselves were trying to speak, and I was the only one left to listen. On a small shelf, I found remnants of personal items. A tin cup, rusted and dented. A book, its cover faded and corners frayed, pages yellowed with age. A few scraps of paper, curled and fragile, carried handwriting that trembled slightly as though the writer had been afraid, yet compelled to record something that could not be spoken aloud. I picked up one of the papers carefully. A single sentence repeated over and over in the cramped, uneven letters of someone pressed into solitude. They do not care. But I remember I could feel the weight of the room pressing in. The cell was not merely empty. It was saturated with memory. Every scratch, every scuff, every forgotten item held fragments of a life confined within these walls. And those fragments were heavy, lingering, pressing on my awareness as though the prisoner had not left entirely, had never truly gone. I shivered, the cold air brushing against my skin, and reminded myself to breathe slowly, to remain grounded, even as a sensation of observation crept along the edges of my perception. The corners of the room were especially dark, the shadows curling unnaturally where the flashlight did not reach. I could imagine the prisoner huddled there, knees drawn up, hands gripping the stone, eyes darting toward the tiny window near the ceiling. Perhaps they whispered to themselves, marking the passing hours with small mutters, small rituals, to remind themselves they still existed. Perhaps they scratched the walls to leave evidence of their endurance, proof that even in isolation they had been here, they had lived. I noticed a faint imprint on the floor near the cot, a subtle depression in the dust where a box or container had once rested. I moved closer, brushing away layers of dust, and revealed a small, rusted tin. Inside were a few coins, a folded scrap of paper, and a thin locket. The locket's surface was scratched and dulled, but I opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny photograph, the edges curling with age. The face of the person was small, eyes wide, staring directly outward with a quiet, determined gaze. It struck me, the intimacy of this object, held here for decades, untouched, a tangible fragment of someone's life pressed into memory. I placed the locket back gently, letting my fingers linger on it for a moment. The air felt heavier now, carrying a faint whispering that I could not place. My own thoughts felt louder, intrusive, aware that I was trespassing into someone's private history. I imagined the prisoner returning to this spot, clutching their small treasures, whispering promises to themselves, recording a life that no one outside would remember. And yet, here I was, a century removed, tracing the edges of their existence. The walls drew my attention again, more scratches, more messages pressed into stone. Some were pleas, others declarations. I am still here. The world forgets, but I endure. No one sees, but I see. I read each phrase slowly, letting it settle. The language was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. These were not idle words. They were survival, defiance, a way of asserting identity against a system built to erase it. The room seemed to breathe with me as I moved, the dust lifting faintly with each step. I felt the subtle pulse of memory in the air, a rhythm almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat pressed into the walls. I could almost imagine the prisoner pacing here, counting, waiting, marking each passing day with small acts of endurance. And I understood then that their presence lingered in a way that defied time. I found another small note tucked into a corner. The paper was brittle, edges curling with age, ink faded almost to nothing. I held it up to the light of my flashlight. A single sentence. If you are here, then you must know. Remember us. I felt the weight of that sentence settle into my chest. It was not a threat, not a plea for help, not a confession. It was a reminder, a tether across decades, insisting that the lives pressed into the space had not been entirely erased. I stepped toward the door, slowly, deliberately, letting my eyes drift over the cot, the locket, the scraps of paper, the faint scratches on the walls. Every detail carried a fragment of life, a trace of emotion, a subtle insistence that existence matters, even in solitude. The shadows seemed to linger longer, as though reluctant to let me leave, or perhaps reluctant to let the memories fade into silence once more. As I stepped back into the hallway, the cell seemed to sigh behind me, the air shifting slightly, carrying a faint whisper that I could not fully comprehend. I turned my head, straining, but there was nothing, only shadows and silence, and yet the feeling remained, a quiet, persistent awareness that some presence had followed me out. Walking down the corridor, I realized that the forgotten cell had not only revealed remnants of a life once lived, but it had also left an imprint on me, the weight of memory, the persistence of existence, the quiet defiance against erasure. They pressed gently into my consciousness, subtle but undeniable. I understood that the prisoner's solitude had left an echo that would not fade, a lingering sense of presence that would follow anyone who entered and dared to listen. Even as I moved away, the whispers of my mind continued faintly. Not words, not sentences, but impressions, fragments of emotion, subtle reminders that life, even when constrained and hidden, leaves traces. The forgotten cell had been more than a space. It had been a repository of memory, a vessel of endurance, a silent testament to the persistence of the human spirit in the face of isolation. I stepped out into the exercise yard just as the last traces of daylight were fading, the sky above a deepening gray that seemed almost to swallow sound. The yard was vast, open, yet enclosed by towering stone walls topped with rusted barbed wire. The ground was cracked, patches of weeds pushing stubbornly through the fissures, reclaiming the space with slow persistence. It was silent at first, too silent, and the air carried a faint chill that brushed against my skin and settled in my bones. As I moved slowly across the yard, my footsteps seemed impossibly loud, echoing off the walls and carrying farther than they should have. Each step felt like a declaration, a disturbance of the long-held stillness. And yet, even as I walked, I began to sense subtle movements in the corner of my vision, shadows that flickered against the walls, just beyond the reach of the dying light. I told myself it was the wind, the trick of my eyes adjusting to darkness, but a quiet unease pressed gently against my chest, insisting I pay closer attention. The wind stirred then, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking just beyond comprehension. It was not a word, not a phrase, but the cadence of despair, a trace of voices that had been pressed into the space decades ago. I stopped, letting the sound wash over me. The yard, I realized, was not empty. It carried memory. Every crack, every shadow, every rusted rail seemed to hum with the echoes of those who had once paced here, confined to a narrow existence beneath the open sky, counting moments, counting failures, counting hope that never arrived. I moved closer to the center of the yard, letting the flashlight sweep over cracked concrete. Faint impressions in the dirt suggested the rhythm of human activity. Pacing, standing, leaning, waiting. I imagine the prisoners who have been sent here, forced into the open, measured by stone and metal, their steps mapping hours and days with no one to witness their passage. I could almost feel their presence, a subtle pressure in the air, a quiet insistence that they had been here, that they had been seen and unseen all at once. Shadows shifted again along the wall. I held my breath, scanning slowly. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, slight, just at the edge of visibility, disappearing when I blinked. My heart skipped a beat, and I reminded myself to breathe steadily, to keep my mind grounded. The wind carried more whispers, a chorus of faint sighs and murmurs layered over one another. Each one weighted with its own fragment of despair. I imagined the prisoners pressing their faces against these walls, the open air both a relief and a torment, the freedom incomplete, measured, contained. A solitary bench rested under a broken window on the far side of the yard. I walked toward it carefully, noticing small details along the way. Scratches in the concrete where someone had knelt, faint stains that might have been spilled water or something else. Tiny scraps of paper long decayed into almost nothing. I crouched, brushing away the dust and dirt to reveal the faint imprint of letters, numbers, symbols, perhaps prayers or calculations, left by hands desperate to mark time, to make their presence known. The wind picked up, and with it, the whispers intensified, brushing against my ears in patterns I could not comprehend. They were not words exactly, but fragments, tones, the subtle cadence of someone reaching out across decades. I felt a weight pressing against my chest, a quiet, lingering pressure that was not entirely unpleasant, yet carried an undeniable edge of dread. I realized then that this yard was alive, not in the way we usually think of life, but as a vessel of memory, emotion, and subtle observation. I stood slowly, letting the flashlight sweep over the yard once more. The shadows seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally, elongating along the walls and ground, forming shapes that did not quite match the structures casting them. I felt a subtle shift in the air, a movement that was not mine, that was not wind. Something had passed just beyond my vision, lingering, patient, observing. I told myself it was imagination, but even as I spoke the words, the unease did not leave. Near the edge of the yard, I noticed a cluster of rusted exercise equipment, warped and twisted by time. I approached slowly, flashlight illuminating each piece in turn. The air around them was colder, heavier, and I could almost imagine the prisoners using them in their sparse hours of outdoor activity. The rhythm of movement, the quiet exertion, the small acts of defiance and endurance, all of it seemed to leave traces, subtle yet persistent, embedded in the very metal of the bars, the worn edges of the concrete. A shadow flickered again at the far wall, this time sharper, more distinct. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The outline was humanoid, but there was no detail, no face, no motion beyond the suggestion of presence. My mind tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, a reflection, a memory imposed on the present. Yet the feeling of being observed was undeniable, pressing lightly, insistently. I could almost hear the faintest intake of breath. A sound carried on the wind, brushing against my awareness like the echo of a life remembered. I moved slowly toward the center again, letting the light sweep in wide arcs. The whispers mingled with the wind, creating a layered hum that seemed almost musical in its rhythm. I imagined prisoners walking the same ground, their footsteps pressing into memory, their voices leaving traces in the air that could not dissipate. Each movement, each sigh, each whisper was absorbed by the yard, preserved in a quiet, subtle way that made the space feel alive long after the inhabitants had left. A faint shimmer of movement caught my eye near the far corner. I turned toward it, flashlight fixed, but there was nothing, only the shadows, curling and stretching unnaturally. The whispers grew more distinct, though still unintelligible, a chorus of faint sighs and murmurs, layered over decades of absence. I felt the weight of it pressing on my chest again, and I let my knees bend slightly, grounding myself, letting the cold stone beneath the edges of my shoes anchor me. I imagined the lives that had unfolded here, the despair, the hope, the quiet insistence of endurance. The prisoners had walked these grounds under watchful eyes, constrained by walls and fences, yet their presence left subtle marks that could not fade entirely. Even now, decades later, the echoes remained. I felt a quiet connection to them, a fragile kinship across time, as if acknowledging their existence allowed the weight of the yard to settle gently, without overwhelming me entirely. The wind carried the whispers across the open space, brushing against my face, teasing at the edges of my hearing. I listened closely, letting them wash over me, letting the quiet weight of their presence press into my awareness. It was not threatening. It was not malevolent. It was patient, lingering, insistent in a way that demanded acknowledgement. I understood then that this yard was not empty. It was a repository, a vessel for lives constrained and endured, memories pressed into the open air to be remembered, even if no one remained to witness them fully. I walked slowly toward the exit, casting one last glance over the yard. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the cracked concrete, the faint remnants of human presence pressing against every wall and fence. The whispers faded to a hum as I moved, yet the sense of being observed, of being gently acknowledged by lives long gone, remained. It was subtle, insistent, and I knew it would follow me beyond the walls, beyond the gates, into the quiet spaces of my mind. The yard exhaled quietly as I passed through the doorway, the wind brushing past me with a lingering touch, carrying the faintest echoes of despair, hope, and endurance. The shadows remained just beyond vision, patient, watching, persistent, and I understood, as I walked back into the darkness of the corridors, that the prison itself remembers. It carries the lives within it, the quiet suffering, the fragile acts of survival, and the shadows at midnight are never entirely gone. Even as I turned a corner, leaving the open yard behind, I felt the subtle, lingering presence of those who had walked these grounds long before me. Their whispers, their shadows, their quiet endurance, they were etched into the stone, absorbed by the air, preserved in the space itself. And I knew that the yard would continue to breathe, to remember, and to observe, patient and persistent, long after I was gone. I could feel it before I saw it, a subtle tension in the air, the way the shadows seemed heavier, more insistent, pressing in from the corners of the corridor. My flashlight flickered slightly, not from the battery, but from the subtle unevenness of the energy in the room. Every step I took seemed amplified, echoing through the stone halls, bouncing back to me in uneven intervals that made my own heartbeat feel loud and intrusive. The final door stood in the hallway, massive and imposing, its surface scarred with scratches, dents, and faint etchings of letters almost worn away by time. I had walked these halls before, explored cells, yards, offices, but something about this door was different. It was not locked in the conventional sense. It carried the weight of history, of something long ago sealed, something that had watched and waited. I approached slowly, my hand hovering just above the cold metal handle. A faint whisper brushed against my ear, almost like a sigh, and I froze. The corridor behind me was empty, yet the air felt dense, thick with memory. I swallowed, trying to steady my breath, reminding myself that I was alone, that this was only a building, old and worn, carrying echoes of lives long gone. And yet, the sensation of being watched pressed lightly against my spine, a gentle insistence that I could not dismiss. I gripped the handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked, a long, drawn-out sound that echoed to the hallways, a noise that seemed to reach every corner of the prison, stirring memories long asleep. The air that escaped was colder than I expected, carrying the faintest tang of iron, dust, and something I could not name. I stepped inside cautiously, flashlight sweeping over the interior, every shadow stretching unnaturally, every corner dark and oppressive. The room was sparse but heavy with history. A small desk, long abandoned, was littered with yellowed papers and rusted instruments. The walls were scarred, scratched, messages etched in hurried, desperate handwriting. Some were names, some dates, some phrases that press against the soul. Do not forget me. I am still here. The last time they looked. Each one felt like a finger pressed lightly into my chest, a reminder that this space had been more than stone and mortar. It had held lives, fears, and secrets that refused to die. As I moved further inside, I felt a subtle shift in the air. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision, just out of reach of the light. I turned, slowly, letting my gaze sweep over every surface, every corner. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but the sensation remained. It was as if the walls themselves had awareness, as though the room had been waiting for someone like me to enter, to disturb the weight it carried, to awaken long dormant traces of human presence. I approached the desk, brushing away decades of dust to reveal a collection of ledgers, each page yellowed and fragile. Names were listed in precise, deliberate columns, but next to some were small, cryptic notations. A dash, a circle, a faint mark that might have been a check or a tally. But the meaning was lost to time. My fingers lingered on the pages, tracing the marks, feeling the history pressed into paper. Each name was a life, each mark a story, each blank space a question that would never be answered. A small key lay atop one of the ledgers. I picked it up, turning it over my hand. It was cold, heavier than I expected, and carried a weight I could not explain. Somehow, it felt important, essential to understanding something that the room itself was refusing to reveal. I slipped it into my pocket, uncertain why I did so, yet compelled by some subtle instinct, a quiet whisper from the space itself, suggesting that some part of this place would not let me leave unprepared. I continued to explore slowly, flashlight sweeping over the walls and floor. Faint scratches caught my eye, messages pressed into stone with a care and desperation that was impossible to ignore. I read them aloud softly, letting the words settle into the air. They are always here. Do not trust the silence. If you leave, remember. Each phrase seemed to vibrate slightly, carrying emotion, weight, history. The room was saturated with it, pressing into my awareness with subtle insistence. A narrow staircase led to a small platform above, an observation point that overlooked part of the complex I had not seen before. I climbed slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. At the top, I looked out over the halls and cells I had already explored. The perspective was different. Suddenly, the familiar corridors seemed alive, their shadows stretching unnaturally, the faint outlines of movement just at the edge of perception. I could almost sense the prisoners watching me, their long dead eyes following every motion, every breath. The wind outside pressed faintly against the windowless room, carrying the faintest echoes of the yard, whispers of despair and endurance from decades ago. I leaned against the railing, breathing slowly, trying to absorb the atmosphere, to understand the subtle insistence of memory that pressed against me. And then I felt it, a final shift, a presence behind me, patient, waiting, insistent. I turned slowly. The door I had entered, the one I had just explored, slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the room. My heart jumped, a sudden, violent jolt that left me momentarily frozen. There was no wind, no obvious cause. The handle rattled faintly, a reminder that the door was now closed, sealing me inside the space with whatever weight of memory and presence had lingered here all along. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The room seemed unchanged, yet the air had shifted. Shadows pressed closer to corners. The whispers grew faintly more distinct, layered over one another in patterns I could not comprehend. I moved carefully, flashlight sweeping in slow arcs, each shadow appearing to stretch and shift in response. My mind tried to rationalize it, wind, draft my imagination, but the feeling persisted. I was not alone and the room knew it. I approached the door, testing the handle. It was locked tight, immovable. I shook it lightly, then harder, but it did not budge. A subtle, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the walls, as if the building itself was alive, observing, responding. I stepped back, heart still hammering, letting my mind absorb the subtle, insistent dread that pressed around me. I realized that the room had claimed its attention, that I had disturbed something meant to remain still, and now it lingered, patient, watching, waiting. The shadows moved again, curling along the walls, stretching across the floor. I could feel them pressing in from all sides, yet there was no sound beyond the faint murmur of my own breathing. It was intimate, personal, a psychological weight, a quiet insistence that I was being observed, that the room remembered every action I had taken since entering. Every step, every glance, every whisper thought had been noted, absorbed, and now lingered, pressing lightly against my awareness. I walked to the center of the room, letting the flashlight hover over the desk, the ledgers, the narrow staircase, the corners where shadows pooled thickest. I could feel the presence circling, subtle and patient, not violent, not threatening in a conventional sense, but undeniably aware. I whispered aloud, "I hear you." My words seemed to settle into the air, and for a moment, the room seemed to exhale, the pressure easing slightly, yet never disappearing entirely. Time lost its usual measure here. Minutes stretched into hours, seconds blurring as I explored the room again, revisiting the ledgers, the key, the faint scratches on the walls. The whispers were soft now, almost like a lullaby, carrying fragments of despair, endurance, and memory. I could feel the eyes of the past pressing lightly on me, urging me to acknowledge, to remember, to respect the weight of what had transpired here. Eventually, I moved toward the corner, flashlight hovering, senses alert. I felt the final brush of presence, a whisper of air, a subtle vibration through the floorboard beneath my feet. The room had one last impression to leave. Lingering dread, subtle, persistent, insistent. I understood then that some spaces do not release their histories, that memory and presence can persist beyond reason, and that the shadows in this place would follow anyone who dared enter quietly, patiently, for as long as they remained alive. The door remained closed behind me. I could hear its faint settling. The echo of the slam carried to the corridor beyond. I realized with an unsettling clarity that I did not know if I could leave, or if I had truly been allowed to enter at all. The room had chosen to mark me, to leave its presence lingering, subtle and patient, pressing gently into thought, into memory, into the quietest corners of awareness. Even as I moved to explore elsewhere, the weight followed. It was not a haunting in the traditional sense. It was deeper, slower, more insistent. The final lock was not a barrier. It was an invitation, a tether, a reminder that some histories refuse to release those who witnessed them. And so I walked through the hallways, chest tight, heartbeat echoing, feeling the subtle insistence of memory pressing around me, knowing that the shadows and whispers would never fully leave, lingering quietly, persistently, like a final breath pressed into the air. I paused at the doorway before stepping into the room that had, for decades, been a place of finality and silence. The air felt thicker here, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle instinctively. Even the beam of my flashlight seemed hesitant, as if reluctant to illuminate the space. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the chill crawl along my spine. The stone floor was cold beneath my boots, the walls scarred with the faint traces of time and neglect. The gallows itself stood at the far end, still and silent. The wooden platform was warped with age, its surface pocked with cracks and splinters that had never been repaired. I imagined the steps that led up to it, worn smooth by countless feet, each one carrying a person toward an ending no one could alter. The rope hung heavy, coiled loosely, the noose resting in shadow as though it had been waiting for decades to remind the room of its purpose. I moved closer, letting my flashlight skim over the wood, feeling the texture of the planks beneath my fingertips. They were rough and splintered, faintly sticky in places, as if the memory of those who walked here had left an imprint. I could almost feel the rhythm of their steps, a slow, measured pacing that carried with it fear, defiance, resignation, and despair, all woven together into a quiet, lingering energy. The walls bore faint inscriptions, etched into the stone by hands long gone. Names, dates, brief messages, some desperate, some simple, some nearly illegible. I crouched to read a few, whispering them softly to myself. "Forgive me. I am ready. Do not forget." The words seemed to hang in the air, subtle and insistent, pressing lightly on my chest with their unspoken weight. The room was not empty. It was full of memory, every scar and mark a trace of human presence, a fragment of life pressed against eternity. A small table near the platform held old ledgers and papers, yellow with age, edges curled, some barely held together by fragile binding. I picked up one carefully, brushing the dust away, revealing the faint handwriting of a clerk long dead. The entries were methodical, clinical even, listing names, dates, crimes, and sentences. But between the lines there was more. Tiny notations in the margins, a question mark, a cross, an underlined word. They suggested hesitation, doubt, human emotion pressing against the rigid order of the system. I read slowly, letting each name sink in, imagining the lives behind the ink. The rope swung faintly in the breeze that found its way into the room, and I shivered involuntarily. I reminded myself to breathe steadily, to keep calm. The room had a subtle rhythm, one that I could feel in the soles of my boots, the beat of my heart, the quiet hum of memory that pressed against my awareness. It was as if the very stones had absorbed every sound, every whisper, every tear and breath. And now they released it slowly, carefully, as I moved through the space. I walked around the platform, letting my fingers trail along the edges of the wood. Each scratch, each dent, each darkened stain told a story, though it was not mine to know fully. I imagined the people who had stepped here, some trembling, some defiant, some silent. Their energy lingered faintly in the air, subtle but undeniable. The room did not judge, it remembered, and that memory pressed against me, quiet, patient, insistent. Near the far wall, I noticed a small cabinet, its doors warped and slightly ajar. Inside were remnants of implements, tools used in the administration of justice, now decayed and rusted. I picked up a small item, a clamp, perhaps for restraint, and turned it over my hands. Its weight was heavier than expected, a reminder of the grim purpose it had served. I set it down carefully, letting the sensation linger in my mind. Every object here carried history. Every shadow was a vessel for the past. The air seemed colder as I moved toward the back of the room, toward a window high on the wall. The light outside was dim, fading with the evening, but it cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. They stretched and curled in ways that made the room feel larger than it was, yet more constrictive at the same time. I imagined the prisoner standing here, looking up at the small window, seeing the sky, feeling the weight of freedom denied, the outside world just beyond reach. A faint draft carried whispers with it, too soft to be intelligible, yet heavy with implication. It was as if the room itself was exhaling its memory, pressing the echoes of despair and fear lightly into my awareness. I froze, listening, letting the sound wash over me. There were no words, just a cadence of suffering, endurance, and a quiet insistence that this space had witnessed more than anyone could understand. I knelt by the edge of the platform, brushing away a layer of dust, and noticed faint markings scratched into the wood. A date, a name, a simple plea. My throat tightened as I read it aloud, whispering softly, "Remember me." The word seemed to linger, settling into the air like smoke, pressing gently against my chest. I understood then that the gallows room did not merely house tools and objects. It preserved fragments of lives, of fear, of the final moments pressed into the very fiber of the space. The rope swayed again, faintly, as though stirred by a presence I could not see. I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to stay grounded, to remember that what I felt was memory, lingering in the air, not a living thing. And yet, the sensation of observation was undeniable. It was quiet, subtle, patient, a reminder that the room itself had witnessed, and that it remembered. I moved toward the doorway again, pausing to take one last look around. The shadows curled against the walls. The platform loomed silently, and the faint whisper of the past pressed lightly against me. I realized then that the gallows room was not merely a place of death. It was a repository of experience, a vessel for memory, a quiet testament to the persistence of human presence even in the most final of spaces. As I stepped back into the corridor, the air seemed lighter, though the weight of what I had witnessed remained. I could feel it pressing at the edges of my thoughts, settling quietly in my mind. The gallows room had left its impression, subtle but enduring, and I knew that its presence would follow me beyond these walls, lingering like a faint, persistent shadow. Even now, as I recount the experience, I can feel the weight of that space pressing lightly, insisting that I remember, not just the tools, not just the objects, not just the shadows, but the lives they contained, the fear, the despair, the quiet dignity that persisted even in final moments. The gallows room does not shout. It whispers. It remembers. And for those who listen, it leaves a presence that cannot be ignored. I stepped cautiously into the next cell, the door groaning faintly behind me, echoing down the corridor. The air was thick and still, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust and the subtle mustiness of neglect. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, its beam sweeping across rough stone walls scarred with faint, shallow scratches. At first glance, They seemed random, meaningless. But as I drew closer, the patterns began to emerge, telling stories etched in haste and desperation. The scratches were uneven, some deep, some faint, overlapping each other in chaotic layers. Names, initials, dates, some familiar, others completely illegible, had been pressed into the stone, leaving faint indentations that time could not erase. I knelt to run a fingertip along one cluster, careful not to disturb the fragile surface. The rough grooves pressed into my skin as if the walls themselves had absorbed the emotion of the hands that had made them. I could almost feel their panic, their pleading, the silent weight of hours spent trapped and unseen. Symbols were etched alongside the letters, crude geometric shapes, circles, triangles, lines intersecting in ways I did not immediately understand. They seemed to pulse subtly in the dim light, and I caught myself staring longer than I intended. Were they marks of identity, secret codes between prisoners, or expressions of hopelessness in a place where hope had no room to grow? I could not tell, and that uncertainty pressed lightly, insistently, against my chest. As I moved deeper into the cell, my flashlight illuminated faint streaks of something dark in the stone, perhaps remnant of hands pressed into the wall, traces of sweat, blood, or mud left behind by desperate acts. I inhaled slowly, letting the scent of dust and decay fill my lungs, grounding myself. My heart thumped quietly, a steady reminder that I was alive, that I had entered a space that had once held lives abruptly constrained and broken. The anxiety in the room was palpable, almost tangible. It pressed in around me, not violently, but subtly, like a weight on my shoulders or a finger tracing the nape of my neck. I whispered the name scratched into the walls, hoping that acknowledgement would ease the tension, but the room seemed to lean closer instead, pressing its memory into me. The echoes of footsteps, long gone, seemed to linger faintly, and I could almost hear the faint scrape of fingernails against stone, the soft murmur of whispered names in the shadows. I traced a series of diagonal scratches, almost jagged in their execution, and realized they formed a pattern, a rhythm perhaps born from repetition, from hours of pacing, from the instinct to leave a mark in the world even when the world had turned its back. I imagined a prisoner kneeling here in the darkness, pressing letters and symbols into the wall with a nail or a sharpened piece of metal. Each mark a fragment of identity, a claim to existence in a place that denied it. A subtle draft stirred, carrying the faintest whisper, almost imperceptible, brushing against my ear. It was not words exactly, but the cadence of distress, the quiet rhythm of fear folded into the air itself. I held my breath, letting it wash over me, imagining the cell filled with hundreds of silent, invisible presences, their energy pressing lightly against stone and memory. The room was alive, not with movement, but with residue, the persistent imprint of emotion that refused to fade. I moved toward the far wall, where scratches formed denser clusters. There were names written over names, a palimpsest of despair that had accumulated over decades. Dates were inscribed alongside, marking times of significance that I could not fully comprehend. Some were etched hurriedly, lines overlapping carelessly. Others were carefully formed, deliberate and precise, as though the prisoner had needed these marks to endure, to measure days and months and years against the unchanging stone. The flashlight flickered, and the shadows stretched unnaturally, elongating across the floor and walls. I felt my pulse quicken despite my attempt to stay calm. A corner of the room seemed darker than it should have been, dense with shadow, yet the beam of light fell across it fully. I froze, sensing a subtle movement just beyond the edges of perception. It was not tangible, not visible, but the feeling of being observed pressed lightly, insistently, against my awareness. I knelt again to inspect a particularly crowded cluster of scratches. One sequence repeated a name, scratched over and over, letters deep and jagged, a subtle tremor in the hand that had made them. Next to it, a triangle had been etched, a symbol I did not understand, surrounded by faint tally marks. The energy pressed on the wall was almost like a pulse, a quiet insistence, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing against me. It was a patient, lingering anxiety, not aimed at me, but impossible to ignore. I whispered the symbols aloud, my voice soft, careful. Each word seemed to settle into the air, adding to the chorus of memory. The more I spoke, the more the scratches seemed to respond, as though acknowledging the presence of someone willing to listen. I could almost imagine the prisoner there, long gone, watching silently as I traced their marks, hoping that someone, eventually, would understand that they had been here, that they had existed, that they had mattered. The room itself seemed to breathe with me. The air pressed close to my skin, cool against my cheeks, carrying faint dust motes that shimmered in the beam of my flashlight. Each corner, each crevice, seemed to hum softly with memory. I could feel the rhythm of past despair, a slow, patient heartbeat embedded in stone, pressing lightly, insistent but not cruel. I understood then that the anxiety was not mine alone. It belonged to space, accumulated over decades, waiting for someone to bear witness. I traced my hand along a diagonal series of scratches that seemed almost frantic. The edges were jagged, as though carved in moments of desperation, and I could feel the residual tension, the need for expression pressing lightly into my awareness. I imagined the hands that had made these marks, trembling or firm, searching for some way to release the pressure of confinement, leaving traces that would persist long after they had gone. The whispers grew slightly more distinct, layered over one another, overlapping in faint, unintelligible murmurs. It was not a voice, not a language, but the pattern of human anxiety, pressed into air and stone. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the subtle vibration wash over me, imagining the room filled with invisible presences, each one tracing patterns into stone with fingers that were long gone, each one leaving behind a residue of emotion that time could not erase. I moved toward the center of the room, letting the flashlight illuminate the scratches across every wall. I could see layers upon layers of etching, a palimpsest of fear, hope, defiance, and despair. Each mark was a fragment of life, pressed into stone in moments of desperation. I felt a subtle pull at my chest, the gentle insistence of memory pressing into my awareness, reminded me that this room had held people, that it remembered, that it preserved the essence of those who had been confined here. A faint creak sounded from somewhere beyond the cell, the subtle settling of old stone, yet it made my heart jump. I reminded myself to breathe steadily, to keep my mind anchored, to respect the weight of the space without succumbing to fear. The shadows shifted again, stretching and curling, yet the movement was slow, almost imperceptible. It was patient, deliberate, like the room itself was observing, waiting for me to understand that the marks were not random. They were testimony, faint but enduring. I walked slowly toward the doorway, letting the flashlight sweep over the walls one last time. The scratches and symbols seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, alive in their quiet persistence. I understood that the room carried decades of anxiety, not malevolent, not cruel, but patient and insistent, pressing gently into the mind of anyone willing to witness it. The air was heavy with memory, and I felt its presence linger as I stepped back into the corridor, leaving the cell behind, yet carrying its quiet weight with me. Even now, recalling it, I can feel the subtle pressure, the quiet insistence of those long-gone hands etched into stone. Their anxiety, their desperate attempts to leave a mark, to assert their existence, remains persistent and patient, waiting for someone to see, to hear, to remember. The marks on the walls are not just scratches. They are voices, faint and enduring, pressing gently into the air, impossible to ignore once you have felt their presence. I had been moving slowly through the prison for hours, letting the flashlight lead the way, my footsteps careful, deliberate. Each hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should, shadows deepening in the corners, twisting in ways that made my skin prickle. The heavy stone walls absorbed every sound, amplifying my own breathing. The faint scrape of boots against cracked tiles, the subtle shift of air in empty corridors. I thought I was alone. I wanted to be alone. And then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustle, a quiet movement in the darkness. I paused, breath held, listening. The sound returned, softer this time, but distinct. A whisper or several, overlapping, delicate and careful, almost conversational. I swallowed, trying to convince myself it was the wind, an echo, something natural. But the cadence, the pattern, the almost purposeful rise and fall of the voices suggested otherwise. Someone or something was there. The whispers were not loud. They were careful, measured, as if mindful of my presence. I could not make out words, only tones, syllables brushing against the edges of comprehension. There was a rhythm, a cadence that matched neither my heart nor my breathing, yet seemed to align with some other pulse in the building. It was intelligent, aware, restless. I felt it watching, observing, curious about the intrusion into its domain. I moved slowly, flashlight sweeping in gentle arcs, trying to follow the sound without rushing. The hallways seemed longer now, walls stretching, shadows deepening as though the building itself was reshaping itself in response to the whispers. Every corner I turned revealed nothing but darkness, yet the voices persisted, delicate, insistent, circling around me like slow currents in still water. I paused in a small cell, leaning against the rough stone wall. The whispers seemed closer here, pressing gently against the back of my mind. I imagined the prisoners who had once occupied this space, voices long silenced, caught somewhere between memory and stone. Could this be their echo, lingering after all these years? Or something else entirely, a presence born of the accumulation of fear, despair, and hope in these halls? I could not tell. A faint coldness brushed my cheek, subtle but undeniable. My flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The whispers shifted, forming patterns I could almost perceive. They were patient, deliberate, circling the space, waiting for me to move, to notice, to acknowledge. I whispered into the air, softly, tentatively, "I hear you." The response was subtle, a pause, then a gentle rustle, as though the room itself exhaled. The presence was not angry, not threatening, only curious, restless, patient. I felt a strange pull, a psychological weight pressing lightly against my chest, drawing me deeper into the corridor, deeper into the rhythm of the building, the rhythm of its memory. I moved on, stepping carefully through the hallways. The whispers followed, ebbing and flowing around me, shifting with the angles of the walls, pressing into the corners, curling into shadows. I could feel a presence just beyond the light, patient and deliberate, observing every movement, every breath. The building had a consciousness here, subtle, insistent, woven from decades of confinement and memory. I found myself in a narrow passage between two wings of the prison. The air was colder here, carrying the faint scent of iron and dust. The whispers were louder, closer now, circling in tones that seemed almost like words, patterns I could almost recognize but not fully comprehend. The presence was aware of me, aware that I had come seeking, exploring, listening. I shivered, letting the flashlight hover over the walls, the ceiling, the shadows pooling in corners. A sudden movement in the periphery made my pulse spike, but when I turned fully, there was nothing, only the shadows stretching unnaturally and the whispers circling patient, pressing gently against thought. I realized that the fear was not in the room, not in the building itself, but in the awareness of its watchfulness. Something long gone, something woven from memory, was observing, curious, unyielding. I crouched near a section of wall where the whispers seemed strongest. There were scratches here, faint, overlapping, layered in patterns I could not fully interpret. Names, symbols, hurried etchings pressed into stone with care and desperation. I traced them lightly with my fingers, feeling the subtle vibration of history, the persistent insistence of presence. The whispers shifted slightly as I did, following, adjusting, patient and aware. Time seemed to slow. Minutes stretched into long, indistinct intervals, measured not by the clock, but by the rhythm of whispers, the subtle pulse of memory pressing against the walls. I spoke softly, repeating the faint syllables I thought I heard, letting them settle into the room. The presence seemed to respond, quiet, gentle, circling with deliberate care. It was intelligent, restless, but not cruel. I moved along the hall, flashlight sweeping over every corner, every section of wall. The whispers were layered now, overlapping, forming a subtle chorus, patient and observant. I could almost perceive intent behind the sounds, a deliberate weaving of tones, a subtle insistence that I notice, that I remember, that I respect the history embedded here. A small cell to the right drew me in. The whispers were strongest here, pressing lightly against the stone, curling into the corners, moving with intention. I stepped inside, letting the beam of light sweep across the floor and walls. Faint scratches and symbols covered the surfaces, names etched repeatedly, dates pressed into stone. The energy here was thick, almost tangible, pressing lightly into my chest, making every breath feel deliberate, every movement intentional. I crouched and ran my hand over one cluster of etchings, letters and symbols repeated, over and over, pressed with urgency and despair. I whispered the name softly, letting the sound settle in the cell. The whispers shifted, brushing my ears, curling into the edges of perception. I felt the presence press closer, not with threat, but with attention, as if urging me to understand the lives that had intersected here, the stories that had left imprints on the walls and air. The longer I stayed, the more aware I became of the subtle intelligence in the space. The whispers were not random. They responded to me, to my movements, to my attention. They circled, brushed against the air, shifted as I shifted, a patient, gentle insistence, reminding me that this was no ordinary silence. This was a presence layered, aware, insistent, born of memory and despair and endurance. I leaned back, letting my hand rest lightly against the wall, feeling the subtle vibrations of the whispers press into my mind. The presence seemed to ebb slightly, patient, waiting. I realized then that these were not ghosts in conventional sense, not spirits seeking vengeance, not shadows bent toward malice. They were remnants of the living, traces of consciousness embedded in the space, patient, observant, persistent. I stood slowly, flashlight sweeping the cell one last time. The whispers circled, faint, patient, pressing lightly against my awareness. The air seemed to hum with the rhythm of history, of lives pressed into stone, of voices that refused to fade. I could feel the presence following me as I moved back into the corridor, a subtle, intelligent awareness woven into every shadow, every corner, every stretch of wall. As I left the cell behind, the whispers softened, fading into a patient murmur, but the presence remained subtle and aware, pressing lightly into thought, insistent in its observation. I knew that the memory of this place, of these voices, would linger with me, a quiet weight that pressed gently against my mind. The whispers after midnight would not vanish. They would remain patient, observant, a subtle reminder that the prison did not forget, and neither would its past. I had been moving through the prison for what felt like hours, letting the flashlight sweep ahead of me, tracing the walls, the corners, the faint outlines of objects long forgotten. The silence was oppressive, not the absence of sound, but the weight of it, the way it pressed against me from every direction, wrapping itself around my thoughts. Every footstep echoed like a reminder that I was alive, and that the space around me was not entirely empty. As I approached the exit, the corridor seemed longer than I remembered. The walls, scarred and faded, seemed to stretch, folding shadows over themselves. The air was thick, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust and the subtle decay of stone and dust. My pulse had slowed slightly, but there was still a tension threading through me, an alertness I could not shake. Something followed me, not openly, but persistently, almost shyly. I turned a corner and paused. There, at the edge of my vision, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a motion too fast and too quiet to identify. A shadow, perhaps, or something else. My breath caught, heart thudding quietly, and I forced myself to take a steadying inhale. The beam of my flashlight swept over the spot. Nothing, only the empty corridor, walls lined with faded paint and scratches, faint inscriptions pressed into stone. Yet the feeling persisted, a quiet insistence that I was not alone. I moved slowly, deliberately, each step careful and measured. The sounds followed me. Faint creaks, the whisper of my own boots, and something more subtle, a shifting, a gentle rustle that I could not attribute to wind or structure. I glanced back, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Shadows clung to corners, pooling in darkness, stretching unnaturally, almost in response to me. My mind wanted to rationalize drafty halls, settling stone, but the unease refused to be quieted. The prison was a cage long empty, yet still had an occupant, or perhaps many. I could feel the presence weaving around me, brushing against the edges of my mind, patient, careful, observing. The sensation was not violent, not threatening, but it was insistent, demanding recognition. I whispered softly, to myself more than anything, "I see you. I know you're there." The words seemed to settle briefly. like dust disturbed and then falling again, but the presence did not leave. I passed the cell with the door slightly ajar. Shadows pooled inside, curling along the floor in strange, unnatural shapes. The air smelled faintly of iron and decay. I imagined the lives that had passed through this place, the prisoners pacing, whispering to themselves, scratching marks into walls, leaving traces that time could not erase. The memory of those trapped here seemed alive, subtly, as though the walls themselves were breathing with remembrance. Ahead, the exit door loomed, heavy and imposing, a gateway to freedom from the oppressive silence. And yet, the moment I approached it, the corridor behind me seemed to shift. The shadows stretched, curling in ways that did not align with the beam of my flashlight. The subtle rustle I had been hearing now seemed closer, more deliberate. I dared not turn my head fully, yet my peripheral vision caught movement, a fleeting figure or shape that disappeared the instant I focused on it. I moved steadily, trying to keep my voice and thoughts grounded. "It's nothing," I whispered softly. The words barely disturbed the still air, but repeating them felt necessary. I tried to focus on the texture of the walls, the scratches etched by hands long gone, the faint lines of graffiti, and the cold, hard stone under my fingertips. The physical sensations tethered me, kept me from drifting too far into imagination, yet the sensation of being followed persisted, gentle but insistent, a pressure at the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. The light from the exit doorway spilled faintly into the corridor, a small ribbon of clarity in the oppressive gloom. I stepped toward it, slow, deliberate, each movement measured. The air seemed to vibrate slightly, carrying whispers I could almost hear but not understand, faint, circular, curling around my consciousness. The presence was patient, watching, letting me leave, but not entirely willing to release me. I glanced back once more, and this time the corner of my vision caught it again. A figure, faint and indistinct, shifting just beyond the beam of light. I could not make out details. Only a shadow, elongated and fluid, moving with intent, intelligent, aware. My pulse quickened, and a cold weight pressed lightly against my chest. I reminded myself to breathe steadily, to keep calm, but every rational thought was threaded with a subtle insistence of observation. The exit was close now, light washing over my face, my hands brushing against a heavy door. I could feel the presence weaving around me, a soft pressure in the air, subtle, almost coaxing. It was patient, deliberate, a quiet insistence that I noticed, that I remember, that I acknowledge. I whispered again, softly, "I see you. I know you're here." The rustle of air shifted slightly, almost a response, a gentle acknowledgement without form or shape. My hand found the handle, cold, warm metal, and I pulled it slowly. The door creaked, reluctant, resisting, yet yielding just enough. The corridor behind me seemed to stretch one final time, shadows pooling and curling in ways that my mind could not fully interpret. I stepped through, the presence lingering just beyond the edge of perception, patient, watchful, insistent. Outside, the night air was cool against my face, carrying faint scents of grass, earth, and stone. I took a deep breath, letting the world outside wash over me, grounding myself in the tangible, the present. And yet, even as I walked away, the subtle sense of being followed remained. It was not visible, not immediate, but it pressed gently at the edges of thought, a lingering unease that threaded through my awareness. I could feel in the spaces between heartbeats, in the faint shifting of shadows in the corners of my vision. It was patient, deliberate, not cruel, but insistent. The prison did not release its memories so easily. It did not let go of those who walked its corridors, even those who had never belonged within its walls. I realized then that leaving the shadow did not mean escaping it entirely. It only meant carrying its weight, its presence, forward, threaded subtly into my own perception of the world. Every step I took felt heavier, not with fear, but with awareness, with a quiet insistence of something patient and watchful. Even now, recalling the moment, I feel the subtle pressure, the soft but insistent pull at the edges of thought, a lingering reminder that the past is patient, intelligent, and never truly gone. The shadows, the whispers, the subtle movements, all remain just beyond sight, just beyond comprehension, waiting for the next visitor who listens closely enough to notice. I glanced over my shoulder one last time before the corridor behind me vanished into darkness. There was nothing there, or at least nothing my eyes could confirm. Yet the awareness persisted, a gentle, insistent weight that pressed against memory and imagination alike. Leaving the shadow did not mean it left me. It followed, patient, deliberate, a subtle companion in the quiet spaces of thought, a lingering unease that would not easily fade. The night swallowed the prison behind me, yet its memory, its presence, its subtle insistence carried on. I walked forward into the darkness outside, aware that what I had witnessed, what I had felt, was not merely a figment of imagination, but a persistent echo of human experience, patient, watchful, impossible to ignore once felt. I pushed open the heavy iron door, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the first row of cells. The air was cold, still, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust mixed with dust so thick it seemed to settle on my tongue with every breath. Sunlight, weak and orange from the setting sun, filtered through the high windows, catching on bits of grime and cobwebs. The prison felt alive in its silence, each corner a frozen heartbeat from decades past. The first cell I entered was small, cramped, and eerily familiar in its arrangement. The stone floor was cracked, and the walls bore the faint, faded outlines of graffiti, names scratched hurriedly, dates that made no sense to someone stepping into their world decades later. On the thin, splintered wooden bench lay a yellowed newspaper, its edges curling as though reluctant to let go of the day it had once reported. I reached out, fingertips grazing the brittle paper, and the words seemed to whisper faintly of lives that had passed through this place, lives abruptly constrained by cold walls and iron bars. Every cell had its own story. In the corner of one, a small tin cup rested, dust-covered and forgotten. I imagined the hands that had once held it, tired, anxious, searching for a sense of normalcy in a world ruled by confinement. On the floor, a tattered blanket lay folded, its fibers fraying, but still carrying the faint memory of warmth. I could almost feel the echo of the person who had once slept there, their presence lingering like a faint pulse pressing against the stone. The newspapers scattered on the floors, and benches seemed to carry a life of their own. Headlines spoke of events I had read about in history books, yet in these cells they felt intimate, urgent, like messages meant to anchor the prisoners to a world outside their walls. I read one aloud quietly, the soft rustled paper filling the silence. My voice sounded strange, loud in the hollow corridor, and I immediately hushed myself, realizing how fragile the quiet was here. It wasn't empty, it was attentive, listening. Old belongings were scattered like breadcrumbs through time. A pair of worn shoes tucked beneath a bench, a notebook with brittle pages, faintly inked lines describing thoughts and routines no longer alive. I opened the notebook carefully, each page stiff, words fading. I read snippets, lists of chores, plans for the next day, small observations of other prisoners. The simplicity of it made the space feel even heavier, the weight of lives condensed into minutes and hours stretched endlessly behind bars. I moved from cell to cell, flashlight illuminating corners where darkness had settled thickest. Shadows pooled in unexpected places, folding over themselves, elongating with the passing of the last daylight. The walls were scuffed, scraped, etched with evidence of presence, initials, dates, prayers, curses. Each mark was a whisper of humanity, of someone demanding to be remembered, asserting that they had existed. I traced a series of letters with my finger, feeling the slight indentations pressed into the stone. The names felt alive under my touch, as though the memories of those who carved them still lingered, patient and watchful. Some cells held personal items that made me catch my breath. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, fogged and stained, reflecting the corridor faintly. I imagined the prisoners standing there, trying to catch a glimpse of themselves, trying to preserve a sense of identity that the walls continually threatened to erase. A cup, a plate, a broken comb. There were fragments of daily life frozen into eternity, objects that seemed ordinary until I considered the weight of their abandonment. The air carried faint echoes of sound, or perhaps the suggestion of sound. My own movements, my own breathing, felt magnified, bouncing off stone and metal, filling the empty halls. For a moment, I thought I heard a faint shuffle, as if someone had stepped lightly behind me. I stopped, heart thudding, scanning every shadow. Nothing moved, yet the feeling lingered, subtle and insistent. The prison was not silent. It was full of echoes, alive with a residue of countless routines, tiny gestures, whispered frustrations, sighs, and prayers long past. I knelt to examine the cell at the far end, the walls heavily scratched and inscribed. Here, someone had pressed a series of symbols into the stone, jagged and hurried, but deliberate. I could not decipher them, yet their intent was clear. A human voice trying to assert itself, trying to communicate beyond the boundaries of iron and stone. I traced them lightly with my fingers, and for a moment I felt a pulse, faint and ghostly, like the heartbeat of memory pressing through the centuries. Time seemed to slow. Minutes stretched and pooled around me, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of my own movement and the lingering impression of lives left behind. I imagined the cells filled again, the echo of footsteps on stone floors, murmurs of conversation, whispers of frustration, the soft scrape of pen against paper and notebooks. Each object, each mark on the wall, was a conduit to that past, a portal into the frozen moment of someone's confinement. I noticed the floors had layers of dust interrupted by faint traces of footsteps, too light, too sparse to be recent. I followed them with my eyes, imagining the person who had left them, their routine, their anxiety, their search for meaning in the small, rigid patterns of prison life. The faintest breeze stirred, carrying with the scent of rust and old stone, making the dust shift gently, reminding me of the invisible presence of history pressing softly against the present. The silence, punctuated only by the occasional groan of the old building settling, felt alive. I whispered the names carved into the walls softly, tentatively, and I could almost imagine them responding, not with sound, but with a quiet acknowledgement that someone was noticing, someone was remembering. I realized then that this space did not demand fear to command attention. It demanded awareness, patience, respect. The echoes of the past were subtle, slow-burning, yet persistent, waiting for recognition. I moved toward a cell, where a bundle of papers lay half-decayed on the floor. I knelt, picking them up gently. The pages were brittle, some stuck together, but the ink had not entirely faded. I could read the faint lines, a letter home, a reflection, perhaps a plea for understanding. Each word felt like a small bridge across time, a connection from someone long gone to someone still alive. I read softly, careful not to disturb the fragile connection. The words carried weight, not a horror, but quiet despair of endurance, of lives endured in tiny, painstaking increments. A cracked window allowed a faint ray of sunlight to fall across the corridor, illuminating dust motes that floated like ghosts. I moved slowly, letting the light guide me, tracing each cell carefully. My steps were deliberate, mindful of the fragile weight of memory pressing in from all sides. I could feel in the stone and the iron, in the faint impressions left by hands, footsteps, whispers of lives paused in time. It was not frightening, not in the way horror usually is, but insistent, unsettling in its quiet insistence that I notice and remember. I reached the end of the row, stepping back to take in the corridor as a whole. The cells stretched endlessly, each frozen in its own small, silent narrative. Newspapers, belongings, scratches on walls, faded graffiti. They were all fragments of existence, moments of life preserved unwillingly by stone and neglect. I realized I had been holding my breath, caught in the patient, subtle pull to space. The prison was not empty. It was full of lives, of echoes, of enduring traces of human presence that refused to fade. I exhaled softly, letting my awareness settle, feeling the weight of the corridor press lightly against my mind. The cells were abandoned, yet alive in memory, suspended in time. And as I walked slowly back toward the main hall, I understood that the unease, the sense of lingering presence, was not something I could easily leave behind. It would follow me, subtle and patient, a quiet companion whispering of frozen moments, of lives long gone but not entirely forgotten. I stepped cautiously into the corridor, leaving the frozen cells behind, though their presence seemed to trail me, clinging like a faint, persistent shadow. The walls, once whitewashed and orderly, were now mottled with age and neglect. Patches of paint had peeled away entirely, revealing layers of gray stone beneath, and the dim light from my flashlight flickered across jagged edges. Each step I took echoed down the long hallway, a hollow sound that bounced endlessly, refusing to settle. The corridor seemed to stretch further than it should, impossibly long, as if the building itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. I turned the corner, expecting to see a familiar doorway or a junction, and found the hallway continuing uninterrupted, curling slightly as if hiding some truth just beyond my vision. A chill rose along my spine. My mind knew it was the same corridor I had just walked, but my body insisted otherwise. It felt infinite, and the quiet pressed in so tightly it was nearly suffocating. I paused, listening. The silence was broken by small, subtle sounds that made my skin crawl. The distant creak of metal, the faint scrape of stone against stone, a soft whisper that might have been the wind or something else. Each sound came in uneven intervals, echoing in unpredictable directions, making it impossible to pinpoint a source. My chest tightened with a quiet tension, not fear, but the deep awareness of something intangible moving just beyond perception. The air here was thick, carrying the faint scent of dampness and decay. I could feel it brushing against my skin, settling in my lungs as I inhaled slowly. Each breath felt heavier, burdened by the weight of the past. I tried to focus on the physical world. The rough stone beneath my fingers, the cold metal of the railing along the wall. But the corridor seemed to resist such grounding. Shadows pooled in corners, stretched along walls, and shifted ever so slightly when I looked away. I took a step forward, the floor groaning faintly under my weight. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure at the far end of the corridor, thin and indistinct, standing perfectly still. I froze, eyes locked on the shape, heart thudding softly. But when I blinked, it was gone. The hallway remained empty, yet the sensation of having been observed clung to me like a second skin. I moved on, deliberately slow, listening to the echo of each footstep and trying to convince myself I was imagining it. As I continued, the corridor seemed to narrow subtly, walls closing in as though the building itself were breathing around me. My flashlight beam caught scratches and markings I had not noticed before. Initials, dates, crude drawings etched into the stone. Some looked old, decades old, layered over each other in faintly unreadable sequences. Each mark felt like a whisper, tiny imprint of lives that had moved through this corridor before me, leaving traces that refused to vanish. I passed a doorway leading to what might once have been an office or guard station. The door hung ajar, its wood warped and blackened with age. I shone my light inside and saw a desk cluttered with remnants of paper and ink bottles, dust covered and brittle. A ledger lay open, pages yellowed, entries faintly legible. I imagined the warden sitting here, noting names, times, punishments. Small moment of authority and control preserved in ink long dried. The thought sent a subtle shiver through me. Even in absence, these walls seemed alive with memory, holding on a moment of life and suffering alike. A faint sound came from deeper in the corridor. It was soft at first, indistinct, almost like someone walking slowly, deliberately, though my steps were the only ones I had taken. I stopped, straining to hear. The noise paused as I did, then continued, perfectly in sync with my own movement. My pulse quickened, not with panic, but with a careful, alert tension. I whispered to myself, "It's the building, just a building." But the words fell hollow, unsatisfying. The hallway twisted in ways that seemed impossible. A doorway I was sure I had passed appeared again, or perhaps I had never seen it before. My mind questioned whether I was moving in circles, whether the prison itself was reshaping around me, a maze constructed to confuse, to disorient, to remind me that freedom might be an illusion. The sense of being trapped, of moving endlessly without progress, grew heavy in my chest. I ran my hand along the wall, fingers tracing grooves left by generations of hands, some impatient, some desperate, others idle. Each touch seemed to pull at memory, as though the stone itself remembered the weight of human experience pressed against it. I tried to keep my focus on the present, but the corridor was patient, insistent, gently eroding the boundaries between past and present. The sound returned, now more defined. Faint whispers, almost conversational, drifting from the darkness beyond my flashlight. They weren't words I could understand, only fragments of syllables, sighs, hisses that carried weight and intent. I spun my light in every direction, but there was nothing. The corridor remained empty, yet the presence was undeniable. It moved with me, always at the edges of perception, neither threatening nor friendly, simply persistent. I noticed the floor had subtle dips and rises, small imperfections in the stone that made walking feel uneven, as though the corridor itself were subtly shifting beneath my weight. The shadows lengthened and shortened erratically, defying logic, folding over corners and around pillars that should have been static. I paused again, exhaling slowly, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The corridor seemed endless, but my own awareness of time and distance felt stretched, warped. I reached a junction, the hallway splitting into two directions. Both looked identical, both fading into darkness, both equally silent. I hesitated, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The faintest shuffle echoed behind me. I spun around, heart tightening. Nothing. The corridor was still, yet the feeling remained. I was being watched, or at least followed in some intangible way. I chose a direction, moving slowly, carefully, aware of each footstep, each breath, each subtle shift in the air around me. Objects in the hallway became more distinct the closer I walked. Broken furniture, rusted buckets, splintered with leaning against the walls. Each item seemed carefully placed to remind me of absence, of lives once lived in proximity and now gone. I imagined the prisoners moving past these objects, brushing them with hands long decayed, leaving traces invisible to me yet palpable in the oppressive stillness. The whispering grew faintly louder, synchronized with my own footsteps. I whispered aloud, softly, almost apologetically, "I am not here to harm." The sound of my own voice seemed to ripple through the corridor, met by a pause, then continuation. It was intelligent, aware, but not hostile. Still, the sensation of inescapability pressed down, subtle and unyielding. I realized the corridor wasn't just long. It was designed to feel eternal, to test patience, to make every step deliberate. My body wanted to rush forward, to escape the tightening pressure of history and presence, but my mind held me back, fascinated and respectful of the weight surrounding me. I walked slowly, feeling the cool stone under my fingertips, letting each mark, each scratch, each whisper anchor me while reminding me I was not alone. By the time I reached the far end, though I could not be certain it was the end, I felt the corridor's subtle insistence more keenly than ever. The walls seemed alive with memory, the floor carrying echoes of footsteps I could no longer distinguish from my own, the air thick with the residue of despair, hope, anger, and endurance. I realized then that the corridor's purpose was not to trap physically, but to impress psychologically, a slow, creeping awareness of the human experience embedded into every stone, every mark, every shadow. I paused, flashlight sweeping the space one last time, taking an impossibly long stretch I had traversed. The whispers softened, receding into the corners of the hall, leaving a quiet hum in my mind. The hallway was still, yet I could feel it pressing against me, gently, subtly, a lingering reminder that the corridor was never empty, never silent, never forgotten. As I finally stepped into a slightly wider hall, the oppressive, inescapable sensation began to lift, though only slightly. I realized I carried it with me now, threaded into my awareness, a quiet, persistent companion that would not easily fade. The prison and its endlessly stretching corridor had left its mark, not in sight or sound alone, but in the slow, deliberate unease etched into my memory. I paused at the base of the stairwell, the flashlight barely illuminating the worn stone steps that spiraled upward into shadow. The air here felt different, heavier, colder, carrying the faint, iron tang of old blood and rust, as if the memory of pain itself had seeped into the very walls. I stepped cautiously onto the first stair, the groan of the stone underfoot echoing in the hollow chamber. That's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate footstep, almost imperceptible, coming from above. I froze, heart beating slower now, not from fear exactly, but from the eerie recognition that I was not alone. My own foot hovered mid-air, waiting, listening. The step repeated, almost in rhythm of mine, as though someone or something was walking in parallel with me, unseen, above. The light of my flashlight flickered slightly as I looked up the stairwell, trying to pierce the thick darkness. Nothing moved, yet the sound continued, each step deliberate, measured, echoing in a way that seemed to follow me, adjusting its rhythm to mine. I took another step cautiously, and so did the invisible companion above, the soft creak of old wood carrying down the spiral. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the building settling. Perhaps it was my mind, filling empty space with expectation. But the corridor behind me and the cells I had passed through had already proven that logic was fragile here. The prison had a way of bending perception, of slowing time, of convincing a person that they were being observed, always observed, by something both human and inhuman at once. The stairs seemed endless. As I ascended, the air grew colder, my breath misty in front of me. The faint smell of damp stone and mildew pressed against my nose, making my head swim slightly. I felt the stairs under my hand, the cold stone railings smooth yet worn, shaped by decades of touch. But the steps above, soft, light, echoing, kept me on edge. I couldn't hear a footfall directly in front of me, yet I could sense it, a parallel presence following, always just out of reach. I paused on a landing, flashlights sweeping the upper walls. Here, the prison's history seemed to converge. Marks of desperation were etched into the stone. Scratches from fingernails, deep gouges carved with obvious frustration or fear. I traced them lightly with my fingertips, feeling the echoes of trapped anger, small bursts of rebellion, private curses meant for ears long gone. The footsteps above slowed as if listening, shifting slightly in response to my movement. I whispered softly, almost apologetically, "I mean no harm." My voice echoed faintly, bouncing off the walls, yet the footsteps responded with a subtle shift, a delay, an adjustment that made my skin prickle. It was impossible to tell if the presence was human, or something older, something formed from the weight of all those who had walked these stairs before. As I moved upward, each step carried with it the accumulated weight of those who had ascended and descended the stairwell over decades. I imagined prisoners clutching railings with trembling hands, hesitant guards pacing quietly, the occasional clink of keys echoing in the distance. All of them left something behind. Pressure in the stone, energy in the air, memories that the building had absorbed like the walls themselves were living records. The further I climbed, the more the whispers emerged, faint and overlapping. At first, they were indistinct, fragments of words, half-uttered names, sighs, but gradually, they became almost conversational, as if a dozen voices murmured above me in a low, unintelligible symphony. I could feel them pressing against my consciousness, brushing at the edges of my mind. The sound was not frightening, yet it was insistent, persistent, demanding attention. I paused again, listening closely. A distinct rhythm emerged, almost like footsteps in pairs, walking in careful, measured patterns. They weren't random. Whoever or whatever was above mirrored me perfectly, never too close, never too far. The stairwell spiral made it impossible to see the origin of the sound, and yet I was certain it was there, patient, waiting, following. My own breathing became part of the symphony. Inhaling, exhaling. I tried to ground myself in the present, but the whispers continued, growing more layered, overlapping with other sounds I couldn't identify. The faint scuff of shoes on worn stone, a chair scraping somewhere distant, a soft moan that might have been carried from a far-off cell. My mind tried to separate the noises, to assign them the logical sources, but the building resisted understanding. I reached another landing. The walls here scarred more deeply. Names and initials carved with different tools, in different hands, form a patchwork of desperate communication. Some were recent, others decades old. I imagined the person who had etched these, standing here in the shadow of the stairwell, hearing the same creaks, the same whispers, feeling the same oppressive air. I traced a line of letters with my fingertip. A name, a date, a fragment of phrase I could not fully read. It hummed faintly under my touch, like the stone remembered, like memory could be felt physically. The footsteps above quickened subtly. I stopped moving, heart rate rising with the quiet tension. I could sense the presence pausing, adjusting, aware of me in a way that defied description. I whispered again, "I am only passing through." There was a faint echo, a pause, and then the sound resumed, just slightly shifted. The stairwell had become an instrument of patience, guiding me, testing me, pulling me into its slow rhythm. I climbed again, each step deliberate, trying to keep my thoughts focused. I imagined the prisoners who had used the stairwell, running from guards, moving with hesitation, carrying heavy burdens, both physical and mental. Their presence was palpable here, pressing subtly against me, layered with a new, unseen visitor that mirrored my movement. It was a weight I could not shed, subtle but unrelenting. A faint breeze brushed my cheek. It carried the smell of damp stone, dust, and something faintly metallic. My flashlight flickered as though shivering, and for a brief instant, I could have sworn I saw a shadow at the top of the stairs. I blinked and it vanished. My pulse quickened, but not in terror, more in awe, in quiet recognition of the corridor's deliberate, patient design. The spiral of the stairwell felt infinite. I reached another landing, exhausted yet compelled to continue. The whispering grew more distinct, though still unintelligible, overlapping syllables, fragments of names, laughter, cries of despair, small conversations held in absence. I realized then that the building itself was speaking through the echoes of those who had passed before me. It was a slow, insistent reminder that history was never truly empty. I moved carefully, sensing the unseen presence adjusting its rhythm, always just beyond the edge of vision, a mirror to my own passage. The stairwell seemed alive, subtly breathing, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Every step I took pressed against memory, pressing against the awareness that this place was not a passive container history, but a participant shaping perception, shaping the slow rhythm of my unease. At last, I reached the top of the stairwell. The echo of my last step hung in the air longer than it should have, and the whispers softened, fading into the background like a tide retreating. I paused at the landing, flashlight sweeping the upper hallway, which opened into a small gallery of rooms long abandoned. The presence seemed to have followed me, hovering at the edge of perception, leaving behind only the faintest suggestion of movement, an almost imperceptible watchfulness. I exhaled slowly, letting my awareness settle, though I knew the sensation would not entirely fade. The stairwell had impressed itself upon me, marking me with the rhythm of its invisible steps, the voices of its unseen tenants, and the patient, deliberate sense of being observed. It was not terrifying, not in conventional sense, but it was insistent, a creeping realization that this place and its memories were permanent, patient, and intimately aware of my presence. I stepped forward into the upper hallway, leaving the stairwell behind, though the echo of those mirrored footsteps remained in my mind. The voices on the stairs had not ended. They had merely receded into the stone, waiting for the next traveler, the next observer, to hear their slow, deliberate story. The hallway at the top of the stairwell opened into a series of narrow corridors, twisting and folding back on themselves in ways that made it hard to remember where I come from. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting each step fall softly on the cold stone floor. The air was heavier up here, carrying a faint chill and the subtle scent of mold and dust, mixed with something sharper, metallic, perhaps old iron from long past injuries, or perhaps simply the memory of them lingering in the walls. As I walked, the silence pressed around me, dense and patient. But beneath the quiet, I could hear it, the faintest whisper of voices. They were soft, delicate, almost hesitant, like people speaking in hushed tones late at night. I stopped and held my breath, straining to catch words, but they were fragments, a laugh that faltered mid-syllable, the edge of a question never fully asked, a sigh that carried the weight of someone long gone. The more I listened, the more I realized that the voices were layered, overlapping. Some were close, as if standing right behind a cracked door or just around the corner. Others seemed impossibly distant, coming from the far end of the hallway, or even from below, echoing up from the stone stairwells I had just climbed. I felt a subtle tremor of disorientation, a sense that the building itself was alive with memory, replaying moments of its past, moments that should have been silent forever. I traced my fingers along the walls as I moved, the rough stone etched with scratches and carvings from decades of hands. Some were initials, some simple dates, some frantic messages left by prisoners in moments of despair. The deeper I went, the more personal the marks seemed, as though the walls had absorbed the thoughts, fears, and hopes of those long gone. I could almost feel their presence pressing softly against my own, invisible and insistent. I passed a doorway that had once led to a small common room. The door hung open, sagging slightly on rusted hinges, revealing the faint outlines of broken benches and tables inside. The air here felt heavier still, saturated with the residue of long-ago activity. I thought of the prisoners who had gathered here, whispering, laughing, arguing. Small gestures of life persisting in a place designed to strip them away. The soft echo of those past conversations seemed to drift through the doorway, teasing at the edge of perception, refusing to resolve into clear words. Every sound in the corridor now seemed amplified by the history of the place. My own breathing became part of it, blending with faint footsteps, soft taps, and murmurs I could not identify. Occasionally a laugh, light, almost playful, floated down from somewhere above or behind, incongruent and startling against the oppressive stillness. I paused and whispered to myself, "It's only memory." But the words felt inadequate, a feeble attempt to anchor myself to reality. I noticed that the floor beneath my feet had slight irregularities, small dips, uneven stones, subtle changes that made walking unpredictable. Each step required attention, yet the movement also drew me deeper into the building's rhythm. The echoes of the past seemed to adjust to my presence, softening, fading, then returning in new configurations, as though the prison were testing my awareness. Seeing how closely I noticed the layers of history embedded in every stone, I approached another stairwell, smaller than the main one, barely wide enough for a single person. The steps were worn smooth by generations of feet, and I could feel the subtle curvature where the stone had been shaped by thousands of ascents and descents. I hesitated, shining my flashlight upward. I imagined the countless prisoners who had climbed these steps, each carrying some burden, fear, guilt, sorrow, hope. The echoes of their lives pressed against the present, and I felt a strange kinship with them, a temporary, fragile link across time. As I climbed, the voices grew slightly louder, almost in response to my movement. I could hear fragments now, snatches of conversation, a shared joke, a name repeated, laughter tinged with sadness. None of it was coherent, yet it carried emotion, as if the walls themselves had learned to mimic human expression. I felt the weight of decades pressing down on me, the constant, subtle insistence of lives remembered. I stopped halfway up the stairwell, breath shallow, flashlight sweeping the upper landing. The air here was colder, the chill seeping through my clothing. I could see the faint outline of a door at the far end, slightly ajar. Beyond it, the voices were more distinct, layered with clarity, almost conversational. I strained to hear, to understand, but the words remained just out of reach. I felt as though I were eavesdropping on a scene from the past, a tableau frozen in time, yet somehow aware of my presence. The corridor above the stairwell was narrower than I had expected, forcing me to move slowly. I could feel the walls pressing inward, not physically, but psychologically, shaping the way I walked, the way I moved, the way I noticed every sound. Every step, every breath, every flicker of shadow became amplified, intertwined with the lingering presence of those long gone. The whispers and laughter drifted around me, teasing, elusive, impossible to fully comprehend. I approached the doorway at the end of the hall, pushing it gently. I revealed a small chamber, dusty and dimly lit by the fading beam of my flashlight. The room smelled of decay and old wood. Broken furniture lay scattered, and remnants of paper were strewn across the floor. As I stepped inside, I could feel the echo of past gatherings, prisoners huddled in quiet corners, whispering secrets, sharing moments of brief reprieve from the harshness of their lives. I crouched, brushing a layer of dust from a chair, and for a moment, the room felt alive. I imagined their voices, soft and deliberate, moving around me. A laugh, faint but clear, bounced off the walls. A whispered argument followed, low and tense, fading before it could resolve. I realized then that the past here was persistent, not gone, not silent. The prison's memory was patient, replaying moments in subtle ways, in echoes that the living could sense but not fully grasp. The chamber's silence returned, but it was not empty. The lingering energy, the soft traces of life from decades past, pressed against me. I moved toward the doorway again, flashlight sweeping over marks on the walls, scratches, symbols, phrases half formed in haste or desperation. Each seemed to carry emotion, as if the writer had imbued them with their own breath, their own small act of existence. Stepping back into the corridor, I felt the whispers follow me. They were faint, not threatening, but persistent, reminders that the prison's history was layered, complex, and enduring. The soft echoes of conversation and laughter drifted around me, teasing and fleeting, refusing to resolve fully. I realized I would carry these sounds with me, imprinted in my mind, long after I left this place. As I made my way toward the exit, the voices began to fade, blending with the natural sounds of the night outside. Wind rustling through broken windows, the distant cry of a bird, the occasional scuff of debris settling on stone floors. Yet I knew they would return, returning in dreams, in quiet moments when the world seemed still. They were patient, persistent, part of the building now as much as the walls themselves. Finally, I stepped into the open air, the night cool and quiet around me. The prison loomed behind, dark and silent. Yet I could feel the echo of its interior still pressing on my consciousness. The whispers, the laughter, the subtle, layered presence of those long gone. They were not gone. They lingered, threaded into the very fabric of my memory, a haunting companion that would walk beside me long after I had left the grounds. I exhaled slowly, letting the night air fill my lungs, but the echo of the prison remained. The soft voices, faint laughter, and subtle traces of life from decades past had found their way into me, leaving me with memories I could neither forget nor fully understand. They were patient, persistent, waiting for the next visitor, the next observer, to hear their stories whispered through the stones, in the corridors, on the stairs, in the quiet echoes of the night.